Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became a quirkless hero part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝐬𝐸 from AO3. So let's start the video. Prologue. Midoriya Izuku starts with the universe opening up in his eyes, entirely his to unfold. There was so much to map out, so much to appreciate, so much to learn. But with such eagerness came inevitable disappointment. There would be a point where you could explore no longer, where parts of the world's mysteries could not be revealed to you. For most of the people on the planet, they were able to explore just fine in this confined space, using their will and power to wander further. But some were crippled by the hand of fate before they could even begin, crawling forward on their hands and knees and blindly bumping into corners, praying for miracles to unlock pathways for them. Midoriya Izuku was not lucky enough to beat most people. From a young age, Izuku loved the concept of quirks. Quirks shaped the person you were, helped you decide what you wanted to do. He loved that his mother could draw objects to her, and although he had never seen it, he thought it was amazing that his father could breathe fire, like a dragon in one of his stories. He would excitedly huff and puff, waiting for smoke to come billowing out of his mouth, or open his fist, hoping to yank something towards him. Theories upon theories filled his head about what he could end up with, what he could do, but, for every thought that he came up with, it never crossed his mind that he could end up with nothing. Years ago, when they were 4 years old, 𝐻𝐻𝐿 got his quirk. It was amazing. He ended up with the most powerful combination of his parents' quirks possible, and it was perfect for his aspiration to be a hero. Izuku knew that one day, 𝐻𝐻𝐿 could rival All Might in terms of his power. All Might was an amazing hero miles and miles away, but 𝐻𝐻𝐿 was right here in front of him, and Izuku was in awe every time he managed to use his quirk in a new and creative way. "Show me again. Show me again," he said excitedly, watching as Bakugo Katsuki sparked up his palm and slowly let out a long, sustained blast in a single direction instead of his usual quick bursts of explosions. "That's amazing, 𝐻𝐻𝐿." "Of course it is, Deku," 𝐻𝐻𝐿 said, sneering. "Did you expect anything less from me?" "Of course not. You come up with something new every day. I already know you're going to be great." "I am great, even now," 𝐻𝐻𝐿 sniffed, holding his head up high. "Unlike you. You need to hurry up and get your quirk, or else you'll be a useless Deku forever. How do you expect to catch up to me and All Might if you can't even do anything yet?" Izuku smiled at him nervously. "I'm sure I'll get mine any day now. We're only 4, there's still plenty of time left for me." "You'd better hope so," he said, scoffing, "but I'm sure whatever it is, it won't be as good as mine. Don't worry about me, 𝐻𝐻𝐿. I'll be a great hero with you, no matter what it is." "I wasn't worried," 𝐻𝐻𝐿 shouted back angrily. Thinking back on that encounter, Izuku smiled. Today, he'd probably find out for sure, and then he could finally join 𝐻𝐻𝐿 on his journey to be a pro hero. Most kids discovered their quirks between the ages of 4 to 6, so everyone in their class had already received theirs, except for Izuku. Today, Izuku and his mother were going to the quirk specialist to find out for sure. Izuku couldn't wait around any longer, he wanted to join 𝐻𝐻𝐿 immediately. The ride to the office was long, with Izuku impatiently stomping his feet in the car. The second 𝐀𝐻𝐿 had stopped the car, Izuku was already unbuckling his seatbelt and half out the door, tugging his mother's door just a moment later. "Wait, Izuku-kun, wait a second," 𝐀𝐻𝐿 said, laughing. "I have to grab my purse." After 𝐀𝐻𝐿 gathered all the identification and health documents she needed, they headed into the building, where the secretary directed them to the doctor's office. For over an hour, they waited while the doctor performed various tests and left the room to look over the results. At long last, he returned, holding a set of papers in his hands and his facial expression slightly grim. 𝐀𝐻𝐿 frowned. "Is something wrong, doctor?" she asked anxiously. The doctor hesitated. "Not necessarily," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure if it will be seen that way by everyone." "What do you mean?" 𝐀𝐻𝐿 questioned. The doctor sighed. Let's take a look at this X-ray. He pulled out a sheet from the stack. As you can see, your son has a double joint in the pinky toe of his foot. This is a vestigial feature that humans have stopped developing and is now uncommon in society. Very strange for a child of fourth-generation quirk users. Today, this is an indicator of quirklessness. The extra joint means that the body has not evolved, or adapted, to this environment, like everyone else's. There was a brief pause, in which both 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐍𝐴 were quiet. 𝐍𝐴 was trying to catch his mother's gaze, so she could reassure him that the doctor wasn't saying what he thought he was saying, but 𝐀𝐦 couldn't look 𝐍𝐴 in the eyes just yet. She swallowed and looked back at the doctor. So, what you're saying is, she began, not finishing what she had concluded, perhaps in the hopes that the doctor would laugh and correct her before she could suggest such a thing in front of 𝐍𝐴, who would no doubt be crushed. He sighed again. I'm sorry, Midoriya-san, your son is quirkless. In the time of centuries past, quirks were non-existent in society. But a few hundred years ago, quirks began to pop up. They were theorized to be advanced evolutionary traits in a changing world, allowing humans to adapt better to their surroundings. Like all other distinguishing human features, quirks did not suddenly manifest in the entire population. It took eons for humans to evolve into what they currently were, to lose the tails and excess hair and hunched primate stature. As it was, the rate of quirk appearance had already been exponentially fast. In about 200 years, most of the population on Earth had quirks. But not everyone. It was so easy to get caught up in the excitement of quirk culture. Theoretically speaking, it was likely that everyone would have quirks in another 100 years or so, with the exception of randomized BRTH defects. But the existence of quirks themselves would lend to a new sort of unspoken class system. It was undeniable that some quirks were entirely overpowered, while others were as prosaic and forgettable as commonplace weeds in the grass. From the moment 𝐍𝐴 had found out he was quirkless, he knew it was the end of something. A social death sentence, a metaphorical place in the electric chair. Coming home that day, his eyes were wide and his hands were shaking. He was trembling in place while his mother cast troubled, sad looks at him the entire ride home. His face felt too hot and his stomach sunk. His heartbeat was erratic, alternating between two slow pauses between beats, and frenzied, rapid pattering. The streetlights and neon signs, even the setting sun itself, were too bright and saturated, utterly lurid and blinding. The voices on the radio, his mother's anxious words, those amounted to nothing but muddled background sounds. By the time they arrived home, 𝐍𝐴 meandered aimlessly to his room, as though in a trance, while his mother followed him worriedly. Like he was on autopilot, he turned on his computer and waited for it to load. The upbeat tune of the startup system was out of place, incongruous, with the sounds of uneven breathing from 𝐍𝐴 and 𝐀𝐦's frantic requests for him to speak to her. In a few minutes, 𝐍𝐴 brought up a bookmarked video, one that he'd watched 1,000,000 times, maybe more, and never failed to instill him with joy and pride and hope. Watching it now, he didn't feel any of those things. He didn't feel very much at all. His mind was still numb from shock, and his hands still hadn't stopped trembling. The echoes of All Might's laugh in his debut, his familiar catchphrase ringing out in a wasteland of screaming and crying, turning it into hope and relief, it seemed so much further away. 𝐍𝐴 could see his face reflecting back at him on the screen, as though he was the one there in those citizens' time of need. But his face wasn't smiling, or brave, like All Might's. Suddenly, it seemed unbearably fragile and weak, and he couldn't bear to see it on the same screen as All Might's unrelenting glory. His throat closed up and he made a few choking sounds, the first noises since arriving back from the quirk specialist's office. 𝐍𝐴. 𝐍𝐴, please, 𝐀𝐦 pleaded, hands cupping his face and smoothing back his unruly hair, I need to know, are you okay? Still trembling, 𝐍𝐴 plastered a fake smile on his face, the first pinpricks of tears stinging his eyes. Mom, he started, his voice shaky. Mom, I can still be a hero like All Might, right? 𝐍𝐴, I'm so sorry. 𝐀𝐦 cried, throwing her arms around his shoulders and crying with him. 𝐍𝐴's face remained unchanged as hot tears silently slid down his cheeks and his trembling hands refused to curl around his mother's neck. The terrifyingly artificial smile remained pasted on his face, juxtaposed with tear tracks, a perfect depiction of a depressed clown, probably with an equal chance of being anything successful in the future. They remained in that position long into the night, until 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 had calmed down a little. Until his sharp disbelief and denial transformed into pangs of dull sorrow and longing for something to change. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 knew things would be different from then on, but he could never have predicted by how much. Quirkless? 𝐀𝐦 asked, astonished, as if he had never even heard of such a thing. Maybe he hadn't. It sounded so ridiculous, especially when they were in the midst of countless other children giggling away, using their unique quirks around the playground. So what you're telling me is that you really are a useless Deku? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 sighed and looked at the ground. I guess so, he mumbled. 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 continued to stare at him. DMN, he said, apparently still in shock. He seemed to process this for a moment further, before scowling and shifting uncomfortably, looking away. I knew you would never be on my level, but now this just proves it. I had no idea someone could be so weak. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸's head shot back up, lips trembling. I'm not so weak, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸. I'm just, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 paused, struggling to find the words, the same as before. Exactly, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 said, sneering. You're weak. Apparently done with the conversation, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 turned away and stalked off into the distance. Some of their classmates' heads perked up and they eagerly got up to follow him. For a second, he looked confused at the excess attention and his hands began to spark up, but he didn't say anything to actively dissuade them from following him. And when a few of them gushed about his power, none of them even glancing to where he left 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 in the dust, his lips almost lifted up slightly. This is where 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 ended, and 𝐵𝘃𝐲 began. Change doesn't happen overnight, not for anyone. Not for 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸, who was confused and upset about his recent diagnosis, but still had a burning longing to be a hero that was constantly strangled by his newfound feeling of worthlessness. And not for 𝐵𝘃𝐲, who was equally confused and upset about 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸's diagnosis, but even more confused and upset at the kids who began to crowd him eagerly, annoyingly, until he wasn't. 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 had always been loud and aggressive, convinced of his own strength and ability to be the best even before he got his quirk. When his quirk had finally made itself known, it merely supplemented 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸's innate greatness. And when his classmates with weaker quirks, gushed over his power, listening to him raptly and following him around, it was confirmed. And the greatest ones, they had no time to waste on the weakest. 𝐵𝘃𝐲. Show us the biggest blast you can make, one classmate, a boy with retractable gnarled talons, shouted. 𝐵𝘃𝐲 smirked and let out a huge explosion in the sky. The blast range was enormous. All of the kids either gasped in awe, or looked away in fright. Soon, more requests and demands came flooding in by classmates eager to pander to 𝐵𝘃𝐲, cementing their spots of power at the top of the classroom. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 watched from the distance, in wonder as well as envy, not just for his quirk, but also for the spot next to 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 that other kids were filling up instead of him. But interspersed in the growing distance between them, there were moments. Sometimes, 𝐵𝘃𝐻𝐸 seemed to grow tired of the praise, proud smirks turning into scowls. He seemed to like it most of the time, but too much attention tended to be exhausting and aggravating after a while. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 had already asked 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 to show him what he could do, 1,000 times over, and this bland repetition couldn't keep 𝐵𝘃𝐻𝐸 going forever. Deku! 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 yelled out, marching towards 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 and leaving the other kids behind. Are you just going to keep staring like a loser, or are you actually going to say something? I wasn't aware you wanted me to say something, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 said sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. Ah! What does that mean, moron? You don't think my power's that great? Of course I do, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 backtracked quickly, raising his hands in supplication. I just meant that I've seen this all before. So I'm not inventive enough with my own quirk. You think you could do better, quirkless loser? 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 screeched, palms sparking up in rage. No! 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 exclaimed, shaking his head frantically. You're amazing. Of course I know that already, we've experimented with your quirk so many times. Seeming to calm down, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 grunted in response, looking away from 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸. But, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐸 said, a bit hesitant as he pulled out a worn notebook and 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐸 whipped his head back up to glare, I have some more ideas for you. For example, have you tried shooting out explosions through your feet? You could self-propel upwards that way and engage flight. Or maybe you could see how powerful your explosions are when you just shoot them out of a single fingerdip. That could be a great idea for conserving your energy, and you wouldn't use up so much of your sweat reservoir, if they're still effective. And, shut up, DMN nerd. Sorry, Kakin, I just got excited, Izuku mumbled. Humph, Kakin grumbled. Well, maybe I should try out one of your shitty ideas. I guess they can't be entirely useless. Izuku brightened. These moments, they were almost painful. Izuku would eagerly wait for them to happen, only to feel crushing disappointment when they didn't, and anguish when Kakin would ignore him the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, until it came to a day when he didn't. And then the CYCL started all over again. Morning shouting matches on the way to school, afternoons spent watching All Might TV specials, evenings used to experiment with Kakin's quirk. They happened all the time, until it only happened a few times a week, until it only happened once in a while, until it only happened when Mitsuki invited the Midoriyas over, until it just stopped. Kakin seemed eager to become a passing memory while Izuku was trying desperately to hang on for the ride, only to have Kakin push his hand off. Friendship wasn't something that could shatter upon touch. Lingering fondness and old memories kept it patched together, but days of blatant indifference and words filled with underlying insults kept cracking it until it could no longer hold itself together. Quirklessness was a plague that killed everything it touched, Izuku decided. The first time Izuku heard the word, it caused the death of a dream. And when the word was repeated, it set in place the death of a friendship. And when the word was announced to the world, it brought about the death of any kind of social standing or self-confidence he could have. It was just ridiculous. Why did he deserve to feel this way? Why was he the one made to suffer? Did he do something? Izuku didn't like to whine about his plight, not when there were people out there suffering much worse than he was, people out there who were starving or beaten or homeless or depressed, but was it so wrong that he was overcome with hopelessness from time to time? He was 7 years old, now, almost 8, and his entire world seemed to be going nowhere but downhill ever since he found out the truth about himself. Sometimes it was strong to hold the tears back. Being a hero, it meant so much to him, and to have that and everything else taken away was killing him, like a slow-acting poison. But it had been quite a while since his diagnosis, and while he was still upset, Izuku was coming to terms with himself. His mother certainly helped, telling him every day how much she loved him and how he was just as brave and amazing as before. Sometimes he even thought he could still be a hero, but he didn't dare mention this to his mom, not just yet, and definitely not to Kakin, his classmates, or his teacher. But sometimes, in brief pockets of time, he remembered. He remembered what it was like to be filled with enthusiasm and passion for a dream. He remembered his determination, even before he knew what his quirk could be, and how he was convinced that he would be as great as All Might, he would do it no matter what. He both admired and pitied his past self, but mostly he was envious of his old blissful ignorance and the happiness of early days. But with these brief upswings of his mood, he would scour the daily news on TV and new articles on the internet, excited at the heroes with seemingly underwhelming non-offensive type quirks that managed to save people. And he would think, maybe, just maybe, if they could do it, then he could do it too. Maybe that's what spurred him on, that day. Maybe he made the mistake of being in a good mood for once, in front of Kakin, at that. Maybe he should have kept his head down and his mouth shut and dealt with all that painful apathy by keeping his ideals to himself. But then, he was never able to keep his nose out of other people's business, was he? What, you really thought you could face me? Izuku heard Kakin jeer, as he exited out the front of the school doors. He squinted into the courtyard, but couldn't see much of what was going on, just faint explosions and laughter. Izuku frowned. Assuming it was just Kakin messing around with his new friends, he made to turn in the opposite direction and walk home. But then, no. Stop. Please, stop, someone cried. Izuku froze in his tracks. He spun around, and narrowing his eyes, he made out someone on the ground. their hands raised above their head while 𝐀𝐦 leaned over them, hands sparking up as usual. His stomach turned. 𝐀𝐦 looked scary, like always, but there was no way he could leave that boy on the ground, scared and practically imploring someone to help. Taking a deep breath, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 stepped in 𝐀𝐻's direction, slowly, at first, but then hurrying, as fast as he could, when he heard the boy plead with 𝐀𝐻 again. Jogging up to the scene, 𝐀𝐻 and a few of the kids who hung off his every word were snickering, too caught up in the brown-haired boy's fright to notice 𝐬𝐡𝐢 at first. "If you think you can beat me, why don't you get up and prove it?" 𝐀𝐻 taunted, leaning back. The boy was shaking, but he sat up, putting his hands in front of him on the ground. "I don't think I can beat you. I was just saying you didn't need to be so rude all the time. You're lucky to have a quirk like that, but it doesn't mean you're better than me," the boy said firmly, although he looked absolutely terrified. Clearly, it was for good reason, because if 𝐀𝐻 was angry before, he looked furious now. "I'm not better than you." "Then, what, you think you're better than me? You don't make me laugh," 𝐀𝐻 growled, looking anything but amused. At this point, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had had enough. 𝐀𝐻's followers were just hanging back in the distance, glad it wasn't them 𝐀𝐻 was angry at, and other students or pedestrians on the street seemed to walk away, uncaring, or perhaps assuming it was a childish fight. They might be content to walk away while this kid needed help, but 𝐬𝐡𝐢 would feel sick if he just left the boy here, at 𝐀𝐻's mercy, or lack thereof, more aptly. Clearing his throat and taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, finally catching 𝐀𝐻's attention. That's not what he meant, and you know it, 𝐀𝐻. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 shouted, voice tremulous and hands formed into loose fists. He stood in front of the boy on the ground. "Deku," 𝐀𝐻 sneered, "stay out of this. This doesn't concern you. I thought you knew your place." "What place, 𝐀𝐻? It doesn't matter who I am. I know that this is wrong." 𝐀𝐻 blinked slowly, once, and then twice. His features spread out into a menacing, maniacal grin. "Are you challenging me, then? Seriously, Deku? I mean, I already thought 𝐵 was pathetic. He can only bend metal into different shapes, like some kind of overrated toy maker, but at least he can do something. I am doing something, right now, aren't I?" 𝐬𝐡𝐢 asked quietly. "I thought you wanted to be a hero, like 𝐴ll 𝐼𝐻. 𝐴ll 𝐼𝐻 would never do something like this, so how do you expect to be like him, then?" Maybe it was a mistake to say that, because 𝐀𝐻 went straight from mildly amused to enraged, again. "I don't expect to be like 𝐴ll 𝐼𝐻, 𝐀𝐻 said. I expect to be better. You'll never be better if you act like this," 𝐬𝐡𝐢 shouted. "Heroes are supposed to help people, not hurt them. Even I'm doing a better job at that than you are right now." For a moment, everything was silent. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was breathing pretty heavily, but a sinking in his gut told him that there was no way 𝐀𝐻 would take that one lying down. 𝐬𝐡𝐢's eyes were dropped to the ground for a second, and when he looked back up, all he registered was rage, and then a boom, and then 𝗲𝗏, and then he was on the ground, face and hands stinging with pain and his eyes watering. He looked up, almost disbelieving, but if he expected to see any kind of remorse, he would be sorely disappointed. For a moment, he thought he saw a flash of something in 𝐀𝐻's eyes, but he decided it was just wishful thinking when 𝐀𝐻 threw another explosion at 𝐬𝐡𝐢's feet for good measure. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 flinched. "Listen here, Deku," 𝐀𝐻 hissed. "I'm going to be the best hero. You're pathetic, quirkless, but could never do better than me. Because you can never even be a hero in the first place. You'll always be useless, no matter what." On those friendly parting words, 𝐀𝐻 left 𝐬𝐡𝐢 behind, sitting there, shuddering, with scuffed knees and mild burns and a wet face. His friends followed closely, a few glanced back, evidently a bit uncomfortable with what just happened, but ultimately they, too, turned their backs on him. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 wasn't sure how long he sat there in silence, but eventually the sound of someone clearing their throat brought him back. 𝐬𝐡𝐢's head jerked backwards as the brown-haired boy that 𝐀𝐻 was tormenting, Takahashi, squinted his eyes at him. "Why did you do that?" Takahashi asked. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 just stared at him, so Takahashi frowned and asked again. Did you not hear me? I asked why you did that. Everyone else was just walking by, and Takahashi sighed, and I wouldn't have blamed you if you did, too. 𝗵𝘃𝗀's pretty menacing. I know, Izuku said softly. I know 𝐀𝐦 better than anyone. That's why I couldn't just walk by. Takahashi shifted for a second, before nodding, accepting Izuku's explanation. He got up off the ground to brush the dirt off as he offered Izuku a hand, and for a moment, Izuku just stared again at Takahashi's gesture of kindness, wondering if it would spark up too. He quickly shook his head free of the thought, his green curls bobbing erratically in the wind, and smiled weakly, accepting the hand. When he got to his feet, Izuku hesitated, wondering if he should say something more. He thought about what 𝐀𝐦 was saying before and decided Takahashi needed to hear something else. About 𝐀𝐦, Izuku began, as Takahashi looked over at him curiously. He was wrong. He is wrong, I mean. You have a great quirk. Takahashi scoffed. No need to lie to make me feel better. I've already literally been kicked to the ground. Nothing could make me feel much worse. No, I really mean it, Izuku said, shaking his head rapidly. Bending metal may seem useless on a small scale, but getting metal to bend correctly is really important in industrial applications, like automotive engineering, creation of electronic parts, and construction. Most machines involve the use of metal in some way. Your quirk could be really useful when careful metalworking is required, and also save a lot of time and money for companies. Have you ever tried to see how big of a piece you can bend, or how far you can bend it? Or tried to bend really small pieces into intricate shapes? That would be especially useful for computer chips and all right, I get the point, Takahashi interrupted. Feeling sheepish, Izuku made to apologize for rambling, but Takahashi started speaking again before he could. I suppose I never thought of it that way, with people only ever asking me to fix their broken toys, or trash like that, but maybe you're right. Izuku smiled. Of course. All quirks are useful in some way. What does that make you, then? Takahashi asked, lips twisting humorlessly. You don't have a quirk, do you? That's what 𝗵𝘃𝗀 said. Izuku froze. Well, no, but I'd like to think I can still be useful in some ways. People can always make a difference, if they really want to. Maybe so, Takahashi said, looking at Izuku appraisingly. Anyways, thanks, I'll keep that in mind, about my quirk. No problem. Actually, I could stay a little longer and think about more ideas for your quirk, I mean, if you wanted some more help. Izuku said, smiling again. Takahashi hummed, suddenly looking mildly sorrowful. I don't think that's the best idea, sorry, he muttered, looking at Izuku with what was beginning to be a very familiar look, pity. Any hope that was bubbling up in Izuku's chest froze, retreating back to the lonely recesses of his mind. Listen, Deku, was it? Takahashi asked, paying no mind to Izuku's flinch at that name. I appreciate your help and all that, but clearly, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 has it out for you. It's not that I agree with that brute, at all, but I've learned my lesson and I'd like to steer clear of him. And it just doesn't seem like I can do that with you around. It's not like I could defend us, and you definitely can't, so, I'm really sorry. Hopefully you guys will be able to work that out. Takahashi himself sounded doubtful of that last part, but looked firm on everything else he was saying. It's good that he's sure of at least one part, even if it was the part of him that didn't want to spend time with me, Izuku thought humorlessly. The amiable mood that was growing was suddenly stunted, resolutely crushed down into dust by the same hand that crushed Izuku in a different way, just moments ago, albeit indirectly, this time. Or maybe it wasn't 𝗵𝘃𝗀's fault, actually, what was it that Takahashi said? That Izuku definitely couldn't defend them. Right, it always had to come down to that, his own quirklessness, the chokehold that he could never truly escape. But it was okay. Izuku understood. He always understood. With the awkwardness blooming, Takahashi looked uncomfortably at the sidewalk, as if he desperately wanted to reach it so he could walk away from this train wreck. Well, I have to leave now, my mother will be wondering where I am, so I'll see you around, I guess. With that, Takahashi waved and turned around, walking away. Izuku stared at the place where he waved. The palm didn't spark up. It didn't spark up when Takahashi offered his hand to Izuku on the ground either. He almost wished it had, that first time. At least then he would have been wary. He wouldn't have gotten his hopes up for that 1 second, only to have them crushed again in the same conversation. Izuku should have really known better by now. When he got home, Izuku mindlessly scrolled through the daily hero news and videos, as he usually did. His mind was still on the fight, but despite the fact that his self-worth took an overall beating, it was strange. He didn't feel as bad as he thought he would. It didn't really click with him until he was halfway through watching an old All Might interview. Doesn't really matter, All Might was saying sagely. Saving people is the job. It may sound thoughtless, but how they feel about it is irrelevant. People may not be grateful to heroes for all manner of reasons. Maybe it's their hurt pride at needing to be rescued, maybe they're angry because you didn't save someone else instead, maybe it's something else, but at the end of the day, their life is the most important thing. As a hero, you must know that and not always expect kindness. But you should always be kind anyway. That is your duty. Izuku's eyebrows furrowed, and he replayed that part again. Again. Over and over again. That was something. Something that stirred the old urge from inside him. Because Takahashi didn't have to be kind to Izuku in return. At the end of the day, even though things didn't go exactly as Izuku would have wanted, didn't he still do the thing that mattered? Takahashi was in danger and needed rescuing. Izuku stepped in, and once he did, Takahashi was safe. And once the danger was gone, Takahashi was grateful. It was so simple. Maybe it had always been this simple, and Izuku had been too caught up in his own self-pity and despair to even realize it. Being a hero, it was something he always wanted to do, because he wanted to save people. He wanted to make people feel safe, like All Might did. But today, he didn't need a quirk to make someone feel safe. All he needed was a few words and some courage. For a while, that was enough. After the incident with Takahashi, it was easier for Izuku to bear the mild burns and the permanent ash smell that seemed to trail after him. After all, it meant 𝐀𝐦 was fixated on him rather than anyone else. In his head, Izuku would admit to himself that this wasn't the healthiest approach to take either, but he knew how to handle it. 𝐀𝐦 didn't really mean to hurt people, Izuku knew, he was just cementing his place at the top. He wanted to be the best and tended to take other people's opinions the wrong way, twisting them into personal threats against him. But never once did he waver in his ultimate goal. Izuku could respect that and admired his dedication to victory. He knew 𝐀𝐦 was wrong to hurt others, but he also knew it was wrong to write him off completely as a lost cause. After all, someone who wanted to be a hero that badly, someone who used to spend every waking hour obsessing over All Might with Izuku, someone who ranted on how easily they would defeat villains with their power, they couldn't be a bad person, not really. Just a product of society's unspoken class system. So when 𝐀𝐦 ran ahead of him with his new friends, always leaving Izuku struggling behind him with the picture of his back firmly implanted in his head, it was okay. When he heard loud snickering as he struggled to complete the same physical fitness tests that the other boys cheated on with their quirks, it was okay. When 𝐀𝐦 grew less reserved with his craze for power and tested his newest quirk applications on Izuku whenever Izuku tried to stand up for the other kids in the class, it was okay. And when 𝐀𝐦 bragged that he wasn't afraid of jumping into the river, only to fall in while Izuku reached out desperately to make sure he was alright, when 𝐀𝐦 grew furious in ways he didn't see too often, when 𝐀𝐦 let loose his biggest explosion yet on Izuku, causing him to fall back in the river, both freezing and burning, well, that was okay, too. Even if 𝐀𝐦 had some kind of warped misinterpretation of what was really happening, Izuku would always see 𝐀𝐦 as his old friend and try to help him, even if he didn't feel the same. Wasn't that what All Might wanted, too? Times grew tougher, but Izuku's resolve to be a hero grew stronger. He couldn't just stand by and let things happen. Helping people was what he did, what he always wanted to do, and learning that he had a setback should never have stopped him. Real heroes, they never gave up, no matter what. So he would never give up either. That day with Takahashi showed him that sometimes bravery was all that was needed. It wouldn't always be enough, Izuku knew. He couldn't stagnate like this. He had to be better, be stronger. Because something had to change, either him, or Kaken, or the world. The world was a big challenge to tackle at age 8, so he decided to put that one on hold for now. Kaken. Well, changing that one would be about as tough as the world. In the end, the one thing Izuku knew for certainty he could change was himself. Perhaps it wouldn't make anything different. Perhaps Kaken would still be the same inveterate fire starter, screeching that all of Izuku's attempts to be stronger were useless if he was born a weakling. Perhaps the world would still look at him and see a helpless child trying to play hero in a world where he needed to be coddled. But there was one thing Izuku knew for sure: while it was true that changing himself might do absolutely nothing, staying the same would definitely result in failure. And as long as there was a chance, then there was really only one thing left for him to choose. So, with bright pink, stinging arms dripping in ice-cold water, 8-year-old Izuku marched through the front door of his home. He stopped in front of his mother, who was reading a book on the couch. Inko dropped the book in shock, immediately demanding to know what happened to him, but Izuku halted her in her tracks by speaking over her. "Mom," Izuku said. "I want to learn martial arts. Self-defense. Maybe Aikido or Taekwondo." Inko stopped her babbling, looking over her Izuku again. His arms were covered in mild burns and he was dripping wet. But that wasn't all. For months, no, for at least a year, he had been coming home hunched over and unhappy. He even came home with a couple of bruises a few times, and while Izuku always insisted that he had tripped or had done something equally as clumsy, refusing to say anything more about it, he got the feeling that Mom knew. How long had she gone by pretending not to see the visible bruises that were there, for his sake? Not this time. And by the look on her face, it seemed that she agreed. Yes. Yes, that sounds just fine to me, she said, softly but firmly. Not just self-defense though, Izuku said. At least one more, too. Something more offense-based, like judo or Krav Maga. Inko frowned. I'm sure I understand why you want to learn self-defense, Izuku, but why something more? Something like those. It would never make sense to her, for better or for worse. Izuku had never thought to hurt people, no matter what they did to him. Izuku took a deep breath and looked his mother in the eyes, so she could understand how serious he was. Because I want to. No, sorry, Izuku said, pausing for a second to steady himself. Because I'm going to be a hero. Izuku grunted as his back hit the mat yet again. A tall, brown-haired man with intense, narrow eyes frowned down at him. That's the third time today, Midoriya, he said disapprovingly. You're supposed to be better than this. Sorry, Himura-sensei, Izuku mumbled, getting back to his feet. Himura sighed and turned away, crossing his arms. What's on your mind, Midoriya? Clearly we won't be able to fight properly until you get it out of the way. I didn't mean to ruin. You didn't ruin anything, Himura interrupted. It's okay to be preoccupied with your thoughts, but I'd appreciate knowing beforehand so we can deal with it instead of wasting time on half-assed training. Izuku winced. He knew Himura-sensei wasn't truly angry, just stating the situation for what it was, but he couldn't help but feel guilty. For years, Izuku had trained with Himura Kosuke, a man well-renowned for his expertise in multiple martial arts and his maintenance of the best dojo in the city. His teacher was a no-nonsense, blunt man who kicked students out of his dojo as frequently as he turned others into success stories. Which was, to say, a lot. At the annual Japanese and National Martial Arts Championships, students of Himura's dojo had been consistently placing in the top 3 for the past 9 years. Himura really knew how to beat undisciplined kids into shape, turning them from half-hearted wannabe ninjas to well-developed precision fighting machines. But despite the fact that he accepted anyone who wanted to learn, he was also an excellent judge of character and would kick students out if he saw that progress was impossible. Open to everyone he may be, but he made no promises about how long they could stay. Izuku remembered the first time he met Himura-sensei, eagerly dragging his mom by the skirt to the city's finest dojo. "Mom! Here it is!" 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 exclaimed, staring up at the sign in awe. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 looked a bit uneasy, but pushed open the door to let herself and 𝐬𝐡𝐻𝐭 in. Inside, there was a clean-shaven brunette at the front who seemed to be in the middle of demonstrating some forms for a few students in front of him. Hearing the telltale jingle of the door, he looked over, seeing 𝐬𝐻𝐻 and 𝐴𝐻𝐻 by the door, watching curiously. "Complete the next 3 forms in the set, please," he called out to his class. "I expect them to look perfect when I get back." Walking over to the door, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "May I help you?" "Yes," 𝐬𝐻𝐻 said enthusiastically, before 𝐴𝐻𝐻 could speak. Himura's lips seemed to twitch faintly at that. "Nice to meet you, Himura-san. My name is Midoriya 𝐴𝐻𝐻, and this is my son, 𝐬𝐻𝐻. He wants to learn martial arts," 𝐴𝐻𝐻 said, cutting in. "Some kind of self-defense," and, she paused for a second, pursing her lips and glancing warily at 𝐬𝐻𝐻, and then the taller students inside the room, and something more offense-based, as well. "Really?" Himura pondered. "Well, that's interesting. You're quite small, so I think Aikido will work just fine for you. Many women practice it, as well, for that reason. Aikido is the way of harmonious spirit, a way to defend yourself while also protecting your attacker from serious injury. Does that sound alright to you?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻's eyes were fixed on Himura while listening raptly to what he was saying, and he bobbed his head up and down in agreement when Himura was finished. "I don't want to hurt people if I don't have to. I'm going to be a hero," 𝐬𝐻𝐻 declared. "Oh, yeah?" Himura asked, amused. "Well, you'll definitely need something more offensive then. Maybe Krav Maga. But I have to warn you, what?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻 asked curiously. "Martial arts can't be simplified so greatly, but if I had to guess there was an opposite of Aikido, it would be Krav Maga. Aikido aims to peacefully take down the opponent, but Krav Maga is a combination of techniques from boxing, wrestling, judo, karate, and realistic fight training. It's a military defense system developed for the Israel Defense Forces, and some people look down on it because it involves fighting dirty. It's known to emphasize physical aggression and target the most vulnerable areas of the body." Even 𝐬𝐻𝐻 looked uneasy upon hearing that. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 looked shocked. "Are you sure that's something you should be teaching him?" she exclaimed. "If he wants to be a hero, then yes," Himura stated firmly, "yes, it is. In a fight for survival, you shouldn't be worrying about the honorable way to take someone down. You need to win, for yourself and for others. There comes a point when you must realize that damage to others has to happen. Krav Maga is aggressive, but it's the best real-world fighting technique there is. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it will turn you to constant aggression. That's why I actually think it will complement Aikido. One will teach you that harming your opponent is not always necessary, and the other will teach you that you can't always be soft if you want to win. With knowledge of both, you'll have the background to know when you're going too far, but also when you're not going far enough. In this world, holding back can be fatal sometimes." "I understand," 𝐬𝐻𝐻 said seriously. "Good," Himura said, tilting his head downward to look 𝐬𝐻𝐻 in the eyes, "because in this dojo, you must pledge not to use your skill to purposely hurt people. These techniques are to protect yourself and others. Now, are there any more questions, or shall we get started?" 𝐴𝐻𝐻 still looked slightly worried, but appeared to commit herself to sticking firm. "I think he's okay to start," 𝐴𝐻𝐻 began, but 𝐬𝐻𝐻 interrupted her before she could finish. His hands were fidgeting with the frayed ends of his sweatshirt. "Actually," 𝐬𝐻𝐻 mumbled. "I have one more question." "What's that?" Himura asked, head tilted slightly to the left. Is it okay to teach me, even though I'm quirkless?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻 asked, shutting his eyes and wanting to get that revelation out of the way before it could cause any kind of problem down the line. He only heard silence for a few moments, so slowly, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 opened his eyes again, only to see Himura looking at 𝐬𝐻𝐻 blankly, his expression unchanged. "Why the hell would that matter?" he asked, with no inflection in his voice. "You still have 2 arms and 2 legs, don't you?" 𝐬𝐻𝐻 blinked. Well, yes, but nothing, Himura stated with finality. That's all you need to learn martial arts, isn't it? I guess, Izuku said, before asking again, shyly. So then, you don't think it's stupid that I still want to be a hero? Inko winced, although Izuku didn't seem to notice. Himura stared at him for a moment. It doesn't matter what I think, does it? Himura responded briskly, before turning around and beckoning Izuku to follow him to the inner parts of the dojo. Just don't disappoint me, and I won't have to toss you out. Izuku never got an actual response that day. Himura-sensei had started his training on the spot, giving him a uniform and ordering him to find a free space on the mats without giving him ample time to even breathe. But he never treated Izuku any differently. In fact, he made a point of warning Izuku that there would be no one going easy on him. As if he would ever want that anyway. Himura-sensei was truly the picture of indifference. Quirk or no quirk, 6-foot-tall bodybuilder or petite little girl, they all looked the same, to him. As far as he was concerned, martial arts were learnable skills, so there was no reason why one person could learn, but another couldn't. All Might himself could walk into his dojo, and Izuku truly believed that Himura-sensei wouldn't bother giving him a second glance before picking up a uniform and chucking it at his face. So Izuku wasn't sure why he was so hesitant to tell him what was on his mind. Himura-sensei never seemed to care enough to judge him before, so what was there to fear from him now? But, then, maybe that was why. People, as Izuku had learned from scattered old burns and half-hearted excuses, always had a limit. Izuku didn't want to find Himura's. Izuku didn't want to hear derision or scorn from the one person who seemed to treat him with the same general respect as everyone else. He didn't know if he could deal with it, where to go from there. But Himura-sensei continued to stare at Izuku imploringly, eyebrows furrowed and evidently refusing to throw another punch until Izuku opened his mouth. So Izuku took in a deep breath and decided to take the plunge. It was better to be crushed sooner rather than later, wasn't it? We have to start sending in our applications for high schools now, Izuku said slowly. And I want to apply to you, eh? I always planned to apply there, I mean. Himura stared at him. So? Do what you want. But do you think I should? Izuku persisted, holding his breath in anticipation of a negative response. Himura rolled his eyes. Why do you keep asking me these things? It's your life. Who's stopping you? If you want to apply there, then apply there, Himura said, studying his nails. All Might went there, too, Izuku added. I know, Himura sighed, rubbing his forehead, and the other students in this dojo know. The parents know, the school teachers know, the beggar on the street corner knows, hell, even my dog knows. Who doesn't know that? Are you planning on getting to your point any time today? Izuku fidgeted. You think I can get in? Izuku asked quietly. I was under the impression that this was a training session, not afternoon therapy, Himura said dryly. Self-confidence comes from the self, hence the name. I can't help you with that. But you seemed pretty keen on it, even back when you were 8. What's the problem now? The problem? Determination wasn't a cleaning agent that could wash away the ever-present stains of low self-esteem and far-reaching anxiety. And stinging burns, bitter insults, and forced loneliness weren't blemishes that were completely washable. They always tended to leave behind mild traces, no matter how strong you rubbed at them. It was easy, when he was 8, to shoot for the stars when they were so far away, and all he had to do was keep flying upwards as far as the eye could see. It was strong, when he was 14, to take a single step forward into the unknown, when all the barriers like the pesky stratosphere, freezing cold temperatures, lack of oxygen, and crushing pressure were finally making themselves known. As application deadlines loomed closer, Izuku was more and more reminded that his whole life depended on the next few months. Everything that he had been working towards. If things didn't go as he had planned, he wouldn't be 14, hopeful and determined, anymore. He would also be 6, lonely and lost and bitter and afraid. And maybe he wouldn't know how to get back from there. Not again. Izuku started, trying to swallow over the lump in his throat, don't want to disappoint myself, or you. 𝐀𝐦 is applying there. People like 𝐀𝐦 will be applying, too. I don't know if I can compare to them. First of all, never worry about me. That shouldn't even cross your mind, Himura said, and second of all, what does that mean? You're not even going to try. Doesn't sound like you. It's not about that, Izuku insisted, waving his arms. I want to try, more than anything, but the entrance exam for heroics, it always seems to be something destructive. Every time I watch the sports festival, it's obvious that only kids with ostentatious, earth-shattering quirks make it in. The exam is designed that way. So it's not even about how strong I try. I can't destroy buildings with the power of my own will, or with my bare hands, no matter what I do. Then don't, Himura said simply, shifting back into a defensive stance and beckoning Izuku to attack him again. Izuku frowned, not moving from his position. Himura sighed. Clearly, he had thought the conversation was over. What do you mean? You think I should just give up? Himura shrugged. If you want to. I was actually implying that if you really wanted to get into heroics that badly, you should think of another way, but giving up would also solve this problem, technically. What other way could there be? Izuku asked himself under his breath, eyebrows furrowing. He stood in silence for a few moments, thinking strong, before his eyes widened. You're right. Izuku blurted out, as if he just discovered the meaning of the entire universe. That does tend to happen, sometimes. I wish you would also realize that I was right about this being a dojo, where we fight, not spill our feelings all over each other but one realization at a time, I suppose, Himura drawled. Heroes like All Might's old sidekick, Sir Nightai, or underground hero Eraserhead, or that new hero, Heartstopper, who can manipulate people's emotions, Izuku went on, ignoring Himura-sensei's exasperation, they never would have passed the exam. But there's still you, 𝐴𝐻 alumni. Fascinating. Yeah, Izuku breathed, either unaware or uncaring of Himura's clear apathy. It's the sports festival. It doesn't happen so often, and it doesn't make the news, but every once in a while, a kid from general education does really well. I remember now, I've watched it every year since I was 4. Sir Nightai and Eraserhead must have had their festivals before I started watching, but Heartstopper, she was in Gen Ed, and she won the sports festival when I was 9. Meaning she was transferred to heroics. Which means I could be, too. I'm so glad I was able to help, Himura said, tapping his fingers against his thigh with clear impatience. Right, thanks, sensei. Izuku exclaimed, finally getting back into an attack position. Let's hurry up and practice. I need to be even better if I have to win the sports festival. My distinct apologies for taking up so much of your time, Himura said, rolling his eyes. Let's get going. When Izuku and Katsuki were both 4 years old, they would scour the internet for videos of villain fights, or SWCH channels on the TV until it landed on the Daily Hero News, or pick up the newspaper and try to read about which new threats had been defeated. Katsuki would laugh excitedly, maniacally, whenever the hero managed to overcome the villain, watching their every move and practicing with his own quirk. At age 4, Katsuki would envision ways that he could defeat the villain instead, over and over again, until there was no doubt who would win. He had an ingrained battle sense. A natural-born genius. On the other hand, Izuku, having not yet discovered his quirk, would write notes and strategies and special moves and theories until his fingers cramped and there was no room for anything left on the pages of his notebook. Izuku can't remember it himself, but his mother insists that the first notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future Volume 1, as it was now fondly dubbed, was a gift from 𝐀𝐦 for his 4th birthday, after he got tired of Izuku running to get scrap paper every time they were watching a fight. Irony was like a lead-in paint that continued to coat itself over every aspect of Izuku's life. The memory may not be his, but Izuku likes to pretend otherwise. It's a reminder of a time when things were so different. And it serves as a symbol that things could always change again. 10 years later, neither Izuku nor 𝐀𝐦 have changed in this aspect, at least. 𝐀𝐦 is now extremely proficient with his quirk, to the point where Izuku believes any low-rank villain would be unable to face him, and 𝐬𝐡𝐢 still writes cramped essays in his notebooks, now having moved to hero analysis for the future volume 13, clutching it in his hands as he shuffled to the back of his classroom for his last class of the day. Taking his seat, he pulled it out, flipping absent-mindedly through his recent pages on Camus Woods while he waited for the teacher to enter the room and start the lesson. No one seemed to notice him, as usual. His classmates didn't do much of that, these days. Finally, Yukimura-sensei trudged into the class, coffee in hand, about a minute before class was due to start. He was a bored-looking man, constantly glancing at his watch or the classroom clock and sighing, as though his greatest highlight of each day was the end of it. He dropped his briefcase onto his desk with a loud bang and stepped in front of the chalkboard, facing the room and clearing his throat. "Attention, students," he said. "Applications for high school are due to be handed in today. Please put your forms on my desk in a neat pile." Yukimura-sensei sat back down in his chair, sipping his coffee and checking his phone. He evidently wasn't bothered enough to hound students for their paperwork, even if it happened to be vital for their future careers and lives in general. Slowly, students in the class ambled up to front, chatting with each other about where they were applying and what subjects they wanted to take as they dropped off their papers. Izuku's hands trembled as he walked up, hesitating for a second before placing down the life-changing package. He was both excited and worried. This was his first step, meaning any rewards and difficulties would be soon to follow. He spent the remainder of class doodling in his notebook, sketching out 𝐻𝐻𝐿 for her page, while everyone finished dropping off their forms. Yukimura-sensei finally picked up the stack of applications and began to sort through them while the rest of the class walked around to join their friends, laughing and gossiping. Izuku tried not to look around too longingly, convincing himself that he was just really fascinated by 𝐻𝐻𝐿's mask and hair. It was really important to get the purple right, he told himself. Sometimes, in moments like these, it was difficult to breathe. It was so strong to see people around you connect with each other in ways that you never have, and maybe never will. It was so strong to see what you had missed out on, for so many years, while everyone that surrounds you could do it with practiced ease and simple promises to keep in touch. Whenever Izuku felt like this, he could barely stand to look at his notebook. It felt artificial. His chest tightened and stomach dropped. He couldn't bring himself to look at the words, reminding him of the older ones he wrote back when 𝐾𝐦 was around. He couldn't help but wonder if the memories and times they had together were even real, or if he just imagined every playground game and all-night marathon and all the shared peals of laughter, because he was that lonely. Maybe he just made it all up. Or maybe it all happened, but they were just lies manufactured by 𝐾𝐦 all along. He didn't want to believe that it was all true and significant to both of them once, but just not significant enough to last. He didn't want to look at his notebook, but if he stopped, then he would have to look around the room at his laughing classmates again, and that option was infinitely worse. So Izuku just kept tracing the outline of 𝐻𝐿's horns, his pencil pressing harder and harder against the page. The tip broke. He slowly reached for his sharpener and placed the pencil tip inside, turning it around sluggishly. He wished he could go home. "You going, Bakugo?" a boy asked, leaning over Bakugo's desk. Izuku glanced over briefly. "You, of course. Like there's any other school worth a DMN. Don't you dare lump me in with all you extras," Bakugo declared arrogantly. "You, Yukimura-sensei asked, lazily flicking through another page. "Interesting. Isn't that where Midoriya applied, too?" For a moment, time seemed to slow down as both Izuku and Bakugo froze. Then it seemed to pick back up, at twice the speed, as Bakugo's shock slipped back into fury and he whipped his head back a full 180 degrees in half a second to glare at Izuku. His palms were already starting to spark up. "Please refrain from using your quirk in class, Bakugo," Yukimura-sensei said distractedly. Bakugo barely glanced back at their teacher. Instead, he tilted his head up to the clock, which indicated that there were only 5 minutes left of class, and then turned back to Izuku, still seething. Izuku looked back down at his notebook. He knew what was coming. In a twisted way, he liked that he had Bakugo's attention, though. At least someone was paying attention to him. He didn't realize how much he would regret that thought. The bell rang and Izuku's classmates jumped out of their seats excitedly, racing out of the class without even sparing Yukimura-sensei a second thought, eager to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. It was bright and sunny outside that day. The weather was perfectly pleasant and warm. Izuku distinctly remembered this, because it contrasted beautifully with how cold and somber he was feeling. Of course, it didn't start off that way. He, too, felt the warmth on his skin at first. It was pleasant and light, then a little too hot and uncomfortable, then strangely blistering, then oh god it was burning. When the bell rang, Izuku got up and tried to quickly make his way to the door with the rest of his class. He may have liked getting his existence acknowledged from time to time, but he wasn't suicidal. He knew that 𝐻𝐿 was out for BLD, after what he heard. Unfortunately, he was especially persistent today. As expected, Izuku had barely made it down the corridor on the third floor of their school before an explosion ripped through the air, aimed at his feet, making him stumble and fall forward onto his hands and knees. Izuku gasped in shock, dropping the notebook in his hands. His backpack slid off his shoulder and hit the ground, his textbooks and pencils spilling out too. He grunted from the impact with the floor, rubbing his wrists gingerly, and cautiously tilted his head up only to see 𝐻𝐿's fiery glare and the amused once-overs from a few other classmates. "What the F, Deku," 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 said. "You're applying to you, eh? Don't tell me you still think you can be a hero. All this time, and you're still challenging me, like you even have a chance." Izuku sighed, exhausted. "I'm not even applying for heroics, 𝐻𝐿. I'm applying for general education. Surely your ego isn't so massive that even that offends you." "What the hell did you just say to me?" 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 growled, throwing another small explosion into Izuku's face. "It doesn't matter if you're applying to the department for useless extras. I'm going to be the only one from this school going to you, and you're not going to ruin that for me. My application has nothing to do with you," Izuku protested, fighting to stop himself from coughing because of the smoke. "This world doesn't revolve around you, you know. People are allowed to have goals that aren't about you at all." "Bold words for such a DMN liar," 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 said, snarling. His gaze fixated slightly to the left of Izuku. Izuku frowned, following his line of sight, and froze when he saw his notebook. Immediately, he lunged to grab it, but 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 was much quicker. He picked up the notebook, holding it up high, while Izuku again landed at his feet. 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 snorted when he read the title, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. "Still writing in these useless notebooks, Deku," he scoffed. "You can't fool me. I know a challenge when I see one. You're quirkless but can barely get through a hallway without falling over. How the F do you expect to save anyone when you can't even save yourself? How do you expect to be a hero when all you do is hurt people?" Izuku demanded sharply. The mood dropped, but 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 didn't snarl or rant or rage again. He didn't even spark up his fingers. Instead, he just smiled. It was terrifying. Still grinning madly, 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 crouched down to look Izuku in the eyes, speaking quietly for once. "It's good to see that you grew some kind of a backbone over the years, Deku," 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 said softly. "Really, I'm impressed. And don't think I don't see other things, too. You've bulked up a bit, haven't you? You're quicker, you have faster reflexes, you don't flinch as much. You really have gotten stronger." "Yes," Izuku breathed out heavily, staring at 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬. "Well, then, let me offer you some free advice," he said. 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 got back up to his feet, standing, all while dangling Izuku's notebook in front of him, in his left hand. For a moment, Izuku almost thought he would be kind enough to let it go. He really should have learned to stop getting his hopes up. With a single, fluid motion of his right arm, 𝗵𝘃𝐬𝐬 let loose a large explosion on the notebook, not just burning it, but propelling it straight through the open window in the corridor. The notebook flew outside, falling in a parabolic arc, all the way to the front of the school courtyard, where it landed in one of the fountains. "No!" Izuku cried out, scrambling to his knees and reaching his hand out limply towards the window, as though he could still save it. "If you really want to be a hero, Deku, maybe you should take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in your next life, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 said, sneering, before turning his back to 𝐬𝐡𝐚 and walking away. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 stared at him in shock, his lips beginning to tremble and a familiar stinging sensation erupting in his eyes. His ears were ringing and the lights, the overly yellow hallway's lights, were blinding him. He couldn't see, or hear, or feel, or think. How could he say that? 𝐬𝐡𝐚 knew that things hadn't been good between them for a long time, but he was always under the impression that 𝐀𝐦 didn't actually hate him. Just misunderstood him, misinterpreted him, misread him, mistook his actions for something else. All very pretty, shiny, ambiguous words. Easily explainable. Understandable. But this, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 couldn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it. He didn't want to be wrong. Because if he was, then he really, truly, had no one. 𝐀𝐦, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 called out, brokenly and helplessly. He didn't know why he called out again, what he expected, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 to turn back around and take his words back, preferably. Or maybe some kind of hesitation, some sign of remorse. Perhaps a nod of acknowledgement, a quick glance over the toy he broke to decide whether or not it was worth fixing, so he could ruin it all over again some other time. But 𝗵𝘃𝗀 did none of these things. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 had tears sliding over his cheeks and his hands were too shaky to steady himself on the ground and lift himself up. So he just sat there helplessly, as usual. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 had already turned and was traveling down the hallway with his nameless shadows traipsing after him clumsily, but when 𝐬𝐡𝐚 said his name, he stopped. He didn't bother to turn around to face 𝐬𝐡𝐚, but his back was ramrod straight and the muscles in his arms were tense. His fingers were twitching sporadically for some reason. Not sparking up, just twitching. Like there was something he desperately needed to do. Strange. Deku, he said. If you've gotten stronger, then why the F are you still sitting uselessly on the ground, like always? 𝐬𝐡𝐚 said nothing. This time, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 left, and 𝐬𝐡𝐚 didn't bother to try and stop him. Instead, he stayed on the ground, where he belonged. His uniform was a bit singed, his hands and face slightly red. His knees were stinging a bit, from the fall. His face was marked with tear tracks. It was like a perfect caricature of himself, 6 years ago, before he really decided that he could be something. Except he couldn't protect anyone, this time. Back then, he slapped some sense into himself and stopped moping about his condition. He eagerly tackled Aikido practices at the break of dawn and Krav Maga sessions late into the night. He worked himself to the bone every single day, not even taking breaks on weekends or public holidays. He went through forms and techniques over and over again, until he didn't even have to think before attacking anymore. Until his arms had to resist going for a chokehold instead of a hug, until his feet were bleeding and his insides ached. But here he was, 6 years later, and everything was still the same. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was still weak. And 𝗵𝘃𝗀 still knew how to break him with just a few words, and walk away. Walking home was a miserable affair. Having picked up the remnants of his charred notebook from the fountain, he trudged down the sidewalk despondently with the edges of his wet and his shoes and socks dripping uncomfortably. The sun was still up, shining brightly and warmly. People in street-side cafes were laughing and the owner of the flower shop was humming while setting out the bright red tulips in bloom. It was all so off-putting to look at. He looked at his notebook instead. The cover was half burned off and the pages inside were barely holding themselves together. Half of the words on Mount Lady's page were illegible. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 could barely make out the outline on the draft of a hero costume that he drew for himself. It was kind of fitting, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 mused, that 𝐀𝐦 created the series by giving me the first book, and then ended it by burning the last one. Very poetic. Maybe that's why he couldn't do anything, when it came to him. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 had always made him freeze, no matter how much training he did. Something about his face, eager and ready to explode anything and everything, reminded him of the very same 4-year-old who just wanted to talk about heroes and win all the time. For all of 𝐬𝐡𝐚's willingness to talk back to him, he could never bear to throw any punches or flip him over his shoulder or trap him in a chokehold or twist his arm behind his back until he was forced to the ground, or any of the other endless techniques he knew. The very thought of trying to harm his old friend was repellent to him. Of course, he would never say this to 𝗵𝘃𝗀. That would probably just make him angrier. And 𝐬𝐸 knew it wouldn't be like this forever, anyway. He saw no reason to harm 𝗵𝘃𝗀 when there was nothing at stake, when 𝐬𝐸 himself was also barely injured, only a few mild burns and a broken heart, like always, nothing he couldn't handle. But at the sports festival, when 𝐬𝐸 faced 𝗵𝘃𝗀, there would be no holding back. Holding back, 𝐬𝐸 remembered being told, could be fatal. Still, 𝗵𝘃𝗀's words had hit harder than usual today. There was still an ugly, weak part of 𝐬𝐸, a part that he hated, that wanted to have a quirk. As if he'd worked for nothing. And maybe he didn't just want to have a quirk so he could be a hero like All Might, maybe he wanted one because he was still that desperate to be 𝐀𝐦's friend. Sometimes he would imagine what life would be like if he got one of his parents' quirks, if he could breathe fire, or pull objects toward him. Would he sit with 𝐀𝐻 every day, laugh along with him and 𝐀𝐻's other friends? Would they strive to be heroes together? And would he push people around on the playground, too? Would he laugh at the Quirkless, at Takahashi's useless metal-bending quirk? Would he ever be that callous? 𝐬𝐸 would like to think that he would never, but the truth was, he didn't know. 𝐬𝐸 wanted to be thoughtful, forgiving. He wanted to be a symbol for something important. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be strong. But he didn't know if he could be, sometimes. It was these thoughts, swirling around in 𝐬𝐸's head like a maelstrom of despair, that perhaps distracted him from his surroundings. Because as he entered the opening to the dark tunnel, it might have been obvious to him, any other day, that something was off. He could almost hear Himura-sensei yelling at him about how he should always be aware of what was happening around him. But 𝐬𝐸 was so caught up in muttering to himself that he didn't hear the slime oozing up from the sewer grates behind him, tentacles of sludge coming together to form a huge mass of slippery, wet goo. He didn't notice the slight hissing or the bubbling of the tendrils of slime. But as he made to leave the tunnel, he did think it was strange that despite the sunlight just outside the opening, there seemed to be this huge, hulking shadow, much bigger than the size of his whole body, right at the exit. 𝐬𝐸 stopped muttering. Slowly, he turned around, and his eyes widened with shock and fear as he took in some kind of villain, a monster, really, that seemed to be completely made of sludge. "You'll make a perfect skin suit for me to hide in." "Kid," the sludge monster hissed, sounding menacing and self-satisfied. For a brief moment, 𝐬𝐸 considering trying to defend himself by fighting the creature. This moment was, indeed, very brief, because it lasted for perhaps 2.5 seconds as 𝐬𝐸 took in its ever-changing, gelatinous body, before he changed his mind and turned around to run. The monster opened its mouth, leaping on 𝐬𝐸 in the same instant. 𝐬𝐸 yelped as he hit the ground for the third time today. His notebook fell to the side. "Don't worry," the monster soothed, grinning with all its sharp teeth visible. "You'll feel better soon." 𝐬𝐸 choked on the tendrils of slime that forced itself into his mouth, eyes watering. More slime oozed around his neck, lifting him up and getting tighter, until his legs could no longer reach the ground and he couldn't breathe. His hands scrabbled uselessly against the monster, fingers curling and sinking into the sludge ineffectively until they just dropped, too weak to continue. In the dojo, 𝐬𝐸 had been choked many, many times. Attacked from behind, a leap forward from in front of him, legs locked around his neck, all situations from which he could escape with ease. All it took was a well-placed strike to the inside crease of the elbow or knee, or an elbow jammed into the opponent's solar plexus, or a fist to the crotch area. But 𝐬𝐸 had never faced an opponent without an actual body. So instead of getting out of this situation with his 6 years of training and his wits, he dangled helplessly like a puppet on a string, forced to obey its MSTR's will. "I didn't know he was in the city," the monster snarled, irritated with 𝐬𝐸's resistance in spite of how weak it was, "so I've got to get out of here fast, before he tracks me down." 𝐬𝐸's struggling mind managed to piece the words together somehow, becoming even more confused and muddled. Suddenly, all of 𝐬𝐸's air was cut off. He wasn't even struggling anymore, he was dying. This can't be the end, 𝐬𝐸 thought desperately. "Somebody, please." His eyes closed. As if fate finally decided to listen to one of Izuku's prayers, the sewer grate suddenly popped open. The lid banged against the wall of the tunnel. The sludge monster's eyes widened and it turned around, still holding Izuku in its tentacles. "Have no fear, you are safe," a familiar voice called. "Because I am here." The sludge monster created a hand out of its slime, pushing it towards the voice, but, Texas. "Smash!" the voice shouted, as a huge gust of wind ripped apart the sludge monster entirely. Bits of goo went flying all over the tunnel walls, and Izuku finally took in some oxygen, his eyes weakly fluttering open for a second. A bright light shone at the entrance of the tunnel, but Izuku wasn't sure if it was the sun or, is that All Might? That was the last thing his mind registered before he passed out in a puddle of slime. "Wake up! Wake up!" a deep voice insisted, lightly slapping his face, as Izuku struggled to open his eyes. As he did, his eyes widened in surprise and wonder. In front of him was a very familiar face, one with an ever-present, obnoxiously white-toothed smile and bright, blonde hair, with 2 strands sticking up in front. "All Might!" Izuku yelped and leaped backwards, unable to contain his disbelief and excitement. "Well, it's good to see that you're all right," All Might said, beaming brilliantly. "So sorry it took me so long to get here, but it turns out this city's sewer system is quite difficult to navigate." "All Might," he whispered. "But no need to worry, I have captured the evildoer," he declared loudly, holding up a soda bottle that was filled to the brim with slime. Izuku continued to stare, unable to say anything, until he caught sight of his notebook. Izuku began intelligently, "See, could you please sign my notebook?" All Might let out his signature booming laugh. "Take a look inside, my boy." Izuku picked up the notebook from the ground, flipping to the last page, where All Might had already signed the book, right across 2 pages. "Thank you," Izuku exclaimed. "And, thank you, for saving me, All Might, sir. All in a day's work for a hero. And I wish you luck in your journey, your notebook is indeed very impressive. Now, then, I must be off. Have to drop off this villain at the police station," All Might announced, patting his pocket. "Wait!" Izuku shouted, although his heart was still stuttering from the fact that All Might thought his notes were impressive. All this time, Izuku had fought and struggled. His limbs were almost permanently bruised with the great efforts he took to be strong over the years. The thing that kept him going, his dream of being a hero, All Might was always the shining beacon in the distance that he wanted to reach. He couldn't miss this golden opportunity. Kaken had clearly never thought he could be a hero, nor any of his classmates. His schoolteacher couldn't care less, assuming Izuku would probably never amount to much. His mother was supportive of his need to defend himself and learn to fight, but even she looked at him with a bit too much anxiety in her eyes. And when Izuku asked Himura-sensei if he thought it was possible, he had not even deigned to answer him. But none of that mattered, Izuku could deal with all of that. There was only one person who remained a constant in his life, a continuous encouragement for his dream over these years. So Izuku had to ask. He couldn't just let this go. He needed to hear unwavering belief from someone, just once, that he could do this. And if it was All Might himself? No one could dispute that, could they? "All Might," Izuku said. "Do you think it's possible for someone quirkless, like me, to be a hero?" Silence. "No. Not you, too." Izuku's eyes were fixed on All Might's face. Originally encouraging and pleased, Izuku watched as his expression traversed a dangerous path to frozen and awkward and uncomfortable. His heart sunk to the pit of the stomach and the lump in his throat grew bigger, until he felt like maybe he couldn't breathe again. Or maybe he was breathing too heavily, it was strong to tell. Was part of the sludge monster's slime still stuck in his throat? "My boy," All Might began, looking sorrowful and hesitant as his hand rubbed the back of his neck. I'm sorry." Izuku didn't need to hear any more. But, much like watching a train wreck in action, he couldn't turn away. Couldn't take his eyes off the debris, couldn't stop listening to the unholy screeching of the brakes and pained cries of the passengers. Didn't dare to stop observing for even a single second. Because this memory would probably be engraved into his brain for the rest of his natural life. In this world, there are many villains with powerful quirks, All Might explained gently, as if Izuku had never heard of a villain before. As if his notebook, his impressive notebook, didn't cover all the ways that different heroes could take down specific subsets of villains. Izuku almost didn't hear the rest of what All Might was saying, his heartbeat was so loud. Heroes with incredible quirks still have trouble taking these criminals down, myself included, All Might continued sadly. So I just don't think it's possible for someone quirkless to face them. It would be too dangerous. Dangerous. Dangerous, like 𝐀𝐦. Like the sludge monster. Like everyone else, you're not strong enough to beat. If I can't beat them, will I ever be able to beat anyone else? Izuku's gaze never left All Might's face. He, too, was frozen. He didn't know what to say, so he just didn't try. He wasn't sure what his face looked like right then, but it must have been extremely pity-inducing because All Might kept talking, like Izuku when he started his non-stop muttering under his breath. I'm sorry, All Might repeated urgently, clearly struggling to get some kind of response out of him, but if you wish to save people, there are plenty of ways to do so. Policemen, firefighters, paramedics, their jobs may not be glamorous, but we need them. There's more than one way to save people. Izuku continued to stare. If there were a language or medium to express the amount of disappointment he felt in that moment, the amount of confusion and desolation and disturbingly low self-worth, he would write essays upon essays, perhaps filling up another 13 volumes of notebooks. But the only language he knew was Japanese. Okay, he uttered simply. All Might looked unconvinced of Izuku's placid disposition and composure, rude, because Izuku thought he was doing a fine job of masking his unrelenting pain, but eventually his struggle to beat time seemed to win out. I really have to get going, All Might said apologetically, but I wish you luck, young citizen. With that, All Might took to the skies. Maybe if both parties were a little less shaken, they would have noticed the bottle slipping out of All Might's pocket as he jumped up a bit too hastily. It rolled to the edge of the curb. But one of them was flying at the speed of a small airplane, about to lose all energy and troubled by the distraught look he put on a kid's face. And the other felt like he was overheated, yet again, choking, his world was ending. So neither of them noticed a thing. Izuku gazed blankly at the space where All Might was standing. What was that last thing he had said? There's more than one way to save someone. Interesting. There was also more than one way to burn someone, it seemed. As if in a trance, Izuku wandered out of the tunnel area, dazed and feeling like he got hit by a cargo truck speeding down the highway. He wasn't sure where his feet were taking him. Some of the buildings looked familiar, others looked new. He couldn't be bothered to pay attention anymore. It shouldn't have been surprising. No one had ever given him clear, unequivocal approval for his dream. Every one of his proclamations of his determination to be a hero had been met with hesitant faces tinged with unmistakable doubt. He went on ignoring it, pretending they didn't exist, all while the pit in his stomach grew and grew. They had to be wrong. Everyone else had to be wrong. This was the only thing that Izuku had ever known for sure that he wanted. He didn't care much for birthday presents or toys or games. Technically, he had even gone years without friends, so maybe he didn't need those either, but the expressions of relief and joy on people's faces when they were saved, when they knew it wasn't over for them, that was always what he wanted to do for others. It was just so inspiring. Because maybe if the doctor didn't look so saddened when he told the Midoriyas about Izuku's condition, maybe if 𝐻𝐸 didn't apologize to Izuku like it was her fault that such a tragic thing had happened, maybe if 𝐀𝐸 didn't look disgusted, and his classmates didn't look indifferent. Maybe if someone had shown him that it wasn't over for himself, then he, too, could feel like there was no danger anymore. But no one saved him. No, he was treated as though he had some kind of disability, as far as he could remember. Like there was something wrong with him and it couldn't be fixed. It was bad enough to get that kind of judgment from everyone he knew, but from the number one hero. If All Might himself, the ultimate paragon of heroism, couldn't find it within himself to encourage Izuku, then was Izuku's determination actually determination, or was it just sheer blind stupidity and refusal to see his failings? Because when the whole world is telling you something else, collectively, maybe you're the one who's in the wrong. Bang! Bang! Izuku jumped in surprise. A series of explosions and yelling rudely interrupted Izuku's morose thoughts. He frowned, looking up, but there was a loud crowd of people right in front of him blocking his view. "That poor kid," someone murmured. "I hope the heroes do something soon," said another man, craning his neck upward. A villain fight. With a hostage? Izuku's fingers instinctively itched to open the cover of his notebook, ready to start taking notes, before he dropped his hands again, because what was the point? Die, an angry voice screeched, followed by more popping and bursting noises. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Kaken. Anything on his mind was immediately forgotten as he pushed his way through grumbling civilians with his eyes wide and erratic thumping in his chest. He struggled to get through the uncomfortably large mass of bodies just standing around like they were watching a street performance, feeling both fear and irritation. Finally reaching the front of the crowd, his eyes widened in horror. Kaken was being strangled by the sludge monster, the very same one that All Might supposedly captured when Izuku was the one being held in its slimy clutches. And he was struggling. Explosions were popping out of his fists everywhere, with no rhyme or reason. With none of the extraordinary control that Izuku had seen him exhibit so often. The ground was flaming and parts of the surrounding walls and the street were damaged, utterly ripped to shreds, as though they were made of butter instead of reinforced concrete. Kaken looked angry, as usual, his eyebrows were furrowed and his eyes were narrowed and his lips were twisted into a menacing snarl, but he also looked scared. He was choking, like Izuku was choking not too long ago, but the difference was that no one was doing a thing about it. Heroes, so many heroes, were just standing on the sidelines, watching in discomfort and irritation, as if 𝗵𝘃𝗀's life was an annoying occurrence to deal with and they wished the whole situation could be over already, so they could head back home to relax. Mount Lady, 𝐀𝐦 Woods, Death Arms, Backdraft, they were all positioned at the front with their teeth gritted and fists clenched, but they kept glancing around at the civilians, at each other, at the sludge monster. Why weren't they looking at Kaken? As if someone with a miraculous quirk would suddenly emerge and take care of the whole thing for them. Well, Izuku couldn't stand it any longer. He didn't know how they were doing it, but every second he spent standing here uselessly while Kaken's face turned purple made him want to throw up. Slowly, unbidden, his feet starting moving forward, then jogging, then sprinting. Straight past the line of policemen controlling the crowd and the heroes who took notice of him and tried to drag him back. "Hey! Where do you think you're going, kid?" one of them yelled, alarmed. Izuku didn't bother answering. His attention was only on one thing. Friendship was not a two-way street, not always. It was okay that 𝗵𝘃𝗀 couldn't be bothered to think of Izuku, that he felt the need to push Izuku's head down in rising waters, holding it there and watching him struggle just for kicks. But if you truly care about someone, it didn't matter how they felt about you. The only thing that mattered was them. Revenge and vindication and karma were not thoughts that Izuku was even remotely familiar with. And besides, despite 𝗵𝘃𝗀 being 𝗵𝘃𝗀, despite the explosions and cutting words, despite what he suggested to Izuku maybe an hour ago, Izuku knew that he could never just stand there either. He'd throw himself into any fight, kicking and screaming, just to prove that he could win, just to rub it in Izuku's face that he still wasn't strong enough, that he needed to be saved like some kind of damsel in distress. But that would still be okay. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 wanted to be a hero. And he would be, a great one, not like any of the other heroes standing around right now. Izuku neatly leaped over a tentacle of slime whipping its way across the ground, landing on his feet, and continued to run forward. Unfortunately, as he got to the core of the beast, the part that was holding 𝗵𝘃𝗀 hostage, his mind blanked, as his brain finally realized that he never bothered to come up with any kind of plan. His hands scrambled for purchase in the walls of slime that restricted 𝗵𝘃𝗀's body, but his fingers dragged through, unable to grip anything let alone rip him out. "What the hell are you doing, idiot?" 𝗵𝘃𝗀 screeched. Izuku ignored him, dodging another 2 waves of slime tentacles surging downwards to knock him over. He had to think. The body was completely viscous and gelatinous, meaning almost any physical attack would be impossible. However, like all sentient creatures, there had to be some kind of core, some place where necessary organs could be stored, even if it was just a brain. The sludge monster roared, tightening its grip on 𝗵𝘃𝗀, and 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 panicked as he made unpleasant choking noises. Reaching forward, he tried again to grab 𝗵𝘃𝗀, but it was still useless. The sludge monster used 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢's momentary panic to WHP another arm made of slime towards him, one that he was unable to dodge. 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 hit the ground, his backpack sliding off his shoulders in front of him. As he got back to his knees, he noticed the sludge monster looking at him triumphantly, looking at him. Eyes. No matter how many times it reformulated its shape, its eyes always remained in a constant position at the top of the mass of goo. Unchanging. Physical. Picking up his backpack, 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 got off the ground and rushed forward again. He weaved through the slime and reached for 𝗵𝘃𝗀 again, this time, not to grab him, but to draw the sludge monster's attention. Sure enough, it took the bait and roared, leaning downwards and stretching out its body so it could try to capture 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 as well. But 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 stepped back and swung his right arm behind his body first, still holding his backpack. Making a full loop with his arm, he used the momentum to launch it forward with all his strength, hitting the creature directly in the eyes. The sludge monster drew back, roaring, and loosening its grip on 𝗵𝘃𝗀 at the same time. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 gasped, finally taking in some air. At the same time, he let loose huge explosions from his fists, finally breaking apart the monster's grip as slime splattered everywhere. He fell forward onto the ground. But the injury that its eyes suffered was only a momentary distraction. In a flash, the sludge monster was back to normal, and now angrier than before. 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 panicked again, looking around frantically. He doubted that he and 𝗵𝘃𝗀 could run back to the crowd of civilians in time, so he needed to think of something else. Earlier, 𝐴LL·MIGHT destroyed the monster with one smash, a huge burst of wind pressure that blew it apart. Was there anything around that could simulate a blast that strong? Some kind of pressurized air tube used in a store nearby. As it turned out, he didn't have to worry anymore. As his mind worked frantically and the spectators watched on, no one noticed an emaciated, thin blonde who was coughing up blood swallow it all back down in favor of moving forward quickly in the crowd. No one noticed until he forcefully bulked up to a much more recognizable form, pushing through the front line. "Worry not," 𝐴LL·MIGHT declared, grinning brightly. "Because I am here." Wasting no time, 𝐴LL·MIGHT stepped in front of 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 and 𝗵𝘃𝗀, throwing back his arm and pushing it forward again to let loose a scarily destructive, strikingly powerful Detroit smash. The sludge monster was completely obliterated, for the second time today. The entire back end of the street was painted in greenish-brown slime. Both 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 and 𝗵𝘃𝗀 were knocked back to the ground, dazed by the sheer power of 𝐴LL·MIGHT. Despite any lingering feelings of disappointment and awkwardness he felt by looking upon the number one hero, 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢's inner fanboy couldn't be quelled by seeing such an impressive display. He rose back to his feet slowly, stumbling a bit, gazing at the mess that took up an entire street and marveling at the impact that 𝐴LL·MIGHT had. He turned around, only to see 𝐴LL·MIGHT handing the sludge monster off to the police and slipping away, while 𝗵𝘃𝗀 was surrounded by the heroes at the front. Some of them were praising his bravery and his quirk. "Good job, young man. Staying brave out there while the villain had you in its grip, that's impressive. And such a powerful quirk, too. Making explosions, you don't see that so often," another hero gushed. As 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 stared over at them, one of the heroes, 𝗃𝐻𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢, took note. "Hey, you're the reckless kid who ran forward," 𝗃𝐻𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 said, crossing his arms, although he was grinning. "Ah, maybe it was for the best, you really saved your friend, here." At this, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 whipped his head back to glare murderously at 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢, and 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 looked down at his feet. For a second, he allowed himself to feel this glowing praise. For all the times that he was called useless, was unable to fight back, this time, he really saved someone. And people knew it. "Yeah, kid, what was your quirk, anyway?" "I couldn't tell," Backdraft asked, slapping him on the back. Actually, I don't have a quirk," 𝐬𝐻𝑡𝐻𝑢 mumbled. At once, all the heroes froze. Their pride turned sour, into pungent fumes of shock and worry and frustration. "What do you mean, you don't have a quirk?" 𝐷𝐴𝐻 asked, practically shouting. You really ran all the way up there with no way of defending yourself? 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 frowned. I do know how to defend myself, actually. His protest got lost in a litany of rebukes. Kamui Woods was pinching his forehead and Mount Lady was frowning at him reproachfully. Backdraft was beginning to go on about what a liability he was and how he could never do something so stupid again. 𝐷𝐴𝐻 was just shaking his head, mouth open. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 couldn't stand it. Unable to listen to another word, he turned away and started walking, anywhere. Not home, though. He wasn't ready to hear yet more exclamations of worry from his mother, once she turned on the news or heard from the neighbors or just took one look at his face. He needed to go somewhere else, somewhere without judgment. Himura's dojo. Ignoring the hero's shrieks that were increasing in pitch, asking him to get back here, he headed back the same way he came, but instead of turning right, to go home, he turned left and began to run. He didn't want to be out here, naked in the sunlight any longer. He felt exposed. He would go somewhere where no one would care enough to look at him. In his rush, he missed a scarily thin blonde man with eerie blue eyes that was desperately looking around. Neither of them saw the other. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 ran right by him, while the man stood at the fork in the road, confused and disappointed. He stumbled into the dojo, out of breath, right in the midst of one of Himura's karate classes. He must have made quite a sight. His clothes were scuffed and partially ripped from all his close encounters with the pavement, his eyes were most likely tinged with red, his face was blotchy, and he was pretty sure there was slime stuck under his fingernails, in his hair, and all over his uniform. Himura was never known to show any particular apprehension for anything, but in that moment, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 supposed he had looked so pathetic that even the perpetually stone-faced man himself couldn't hold back his reaction of mild concern. Class dismissed, he said shortly, addressing the other students in the dojo. But there are still 20 minutes left for this lesson, one of the kids said, frowning. I can assure you that you are not going to make some kind of groundbreaking achievement in this remaining time, so you may as well head on home, Himura replied. The kid scoffed, but picked up his things and turned to leave while grumbling under his breath. The other students were soon to follow. Once everyone had left the main area of the dojo for the changing rooms or the parking lot outside, Himura turned back to 𝐬𝐡𝐚. I'm assuming you're not here to train, Himura said, sighing. So what's wrong this time? 𝐬𝐡𝐚 opened his mouth. If he were particularly practiced in his eloquence and articulation, he may have been able to calmly explain to Himura the layers upon layers of frustration and disappointment and misery he felt today. He may have separated the different scenarios adding to his current state of anguish, the hurt from hearing 𝐀𝐦's words, the close encounter with death he faced, the pain of hearing All Might's dismissal, the terror he felt when 𝐀𝐦 was in danger, the irritation with the pro-heroes at the scene. He may have detailed the intricacies of each feeling stirred by each event, until it was perfectly clear why he had shown up to the dojo like this. But 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was not eloquent or articulate. He was a mumbling, over-emotional mess who had taken too many hits today, in too many different ways. So he just burst into tears. Himura's eyebrows shot upward. Despite the fact that 𝐬𝐡𝐚 had always found it easy to cry at the drop of a hat, he didn't do so in the dojo. This was a place he felt at his most powerful, and it's not like he often dragged his emotional affairs back here. This wasn't a sight that Himura-sensei would be familiar with. It's fine, Himura said gruffly, awkwardly patting 𝐬𝐡𝐚 on the back. It'll be fine. Somehow, between all the racking sobs and uneven breathing, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 managed to get out the whole story. The nerves over his application, his loneliness as he schools, the frustration at doing nothing while Bakugo knocked him down yet again, the fight with the sludge villain. All Might. Bakugo struggling to breathe. The pro-hero's praise souring to admonishments. All of this, Himura-sensei listened to it with patience, his expressions only changing minutely, although he did look worried when 𝐬𝐡𝐚 talked about being choked by the sludge villain. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 talked and talked between deep breaths, until he couldn't talk anymore and both of them just sat there in silence. Himura seemed to be taking it all in. First of all, I just need to know, are you okay? Himura asked seriously. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 stared at him. I didn't mean emotionally, Himura amended, rolling his eyes, but you said you'd been burned and kicked to the ground a few times, and more importantly, nearly choked to death. I don't think I'm too injured or anything, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 mumbled, looking down at his hands and body. Good, 𝐬𝐬 said. Now, let's take a seat. We need to talk. At this, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 twisted his fingers together anxiously, but nodded and sat down cross-legged on the mats, with 𝐬𝐬 sitting in front of him, eyes focused on 𝐬𝐻𝐬 and fingers steepled together under his chin. He wasn't sure what 𝐬𝐬 wanted to say. Maybe he, too, would reaffirm All Might's words, or denounce him for his inability to actually use self-defense adequately. Maybe this would be the final nail in the coffin. Midoriya 𝐬𝐻𝐬, 𝐬𝐬 began. Do you remember the first time we met? Of course I do, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 said, eyebrows furrowing. What was the last thing I said to you, before we started? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 thought strong, it was a long time ago, and it was strong to keep all the pieces of dialogue together. But he could always remember having nervously asked 𝐬𝐬-sensei if he could be a hero, to which he didn't respond, and, you said not to disappoint you, or you would have to toss me out, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 said. Midoriya, I have to say you've really disappointed me today. 𝐬𝐻𝐬's heart froze. 𝐬𝐬 studied his nails. What? You didn't hear me. I said you disappointed me, 𝐬𝐬 repeated. For a moment, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 was silent. He swallowed. Very faintly, he could feel the sting of tears again. It was kind of incredible, actually. Surely after so many times, just today, he couldn't keep crying, and yet, nothing to say. 𝐬𝐬 asked, tilting his head. I don't know, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 mumbled, fingers twitching. I'm not. I know I should have used everything I learned to fight back. I'm sorry for being too weak, but please don't take this away from me. I promise. Don't make empty promises, he interrupted as 𝐬𝐻𝐬 flinched, and don't apologize for something that was never even the issue. What? 𝐬𝐬 rolled his eyes. You really think I would condemn you for being unable to fight off an actual villain, and a villain with a constantly changing body, at that? Even I couldn't do that. Or for not kicking your childhood friend's butt and choosing to be kind instead. But if you're not upset about that, then what, seriously, do I have to spell everything out for you? 𝐬𝐬 grumbled. Why did you ask for All Might's approval to be a hero? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 stared at him in confusion. Well, he's my idol. And he's the #1 hero, obviously. I just wanted to hear him say I could do it. Then I would know for sure that it was possible. 𝐬𝐬 slapped his hand on top of the mats in apparent frustration. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 jumped in surprise. And therein lies the problem. Why don't you already know for sure? 𝐬𝐬 questioned, irritated. I thought you always wanted to be a hero. So why are you constantly doubting yourself? Well, if no one ever believes that I can do it, if I'm the only person telling myself that I can do it, then why wouldn't I doubt myself? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 asked heatedly, getting a little frustrated himself. If the whole world is telling me that I'm wrong, how can I believe I'm right? Even you don't think I can do it. You never said you thought I could be a hero either. When did I say that to you? 𝐬𝐬 demanded. All I said to you was that it didn't matter what I thought, don't you remember? Of course I remember. How could I forget, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 responded, breathing heavily, that you didn't even bother to answer me. At least everyone else told me what they thought to my face. I had nothing to tell you, Midoriya, 𝐬𝐬 said, finally sitting back and twisting his expression back into studied nonchalance, because I didn't think it was impossible. Strange, yes, I'd never heard of such a thing before. Difficult, definitely. But not impossible. 𝐬𝐻𝐬's indignant rage and stirrings of distress died down almost immediately. He gaped at 𝐬𝐬-sensei, almost disbelieving of what he had heard. Why, you really thought I could do it? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 asked quietly, with something resembling hope creating tremors in his voice. Back then, there was no way for me to know for sure, of course, but, 𝐬𝐬 paused, hesitating, as the years went by, I had never seen determination like yours. Your friends, as you choose to call them for whatever reason, have put you down for years, but you paid them no mind. You only saw your goal. And that was something admirable. Izuku remained quiet, for once, taking in Himura's words. I know I give off the impression that I don't care about much, Himura went on, gaze shifting downwards, and for the most part, that's true. Students are students. I can't have the energy to care for all the people who come and go. But you can be inspiring. Inspiring? Izuku whispered. Himura nodded. In past years, quirklessness was very common. I can't imagine how difficult it must be for someone of your age group, where all the people you know have some kind of a quirk. And because it's so difficult, because you wanted so badly to be a hero, I thought it would be important to prepare you adequately. What do you mean? People will always tell you that you can't do this, Himura stated bluntly, and they won't be saying it because they're trying to be cruel. They'll say it because they think they're being kind. They think it's the truth. And doesn't that hurt the most? It did hurt the most, Izuku realized. It wasn't nice to hear the jeers and taunts of schoolyard bullies, but they were just trying to get a reaction out of him. It was much worse to hear the subtle disbelief of adults, their patronizing pity dripping with every expression. The reason I was disappointed was because you had bothered to ask for approval, for some kind of affirmation in the first place, Himura explained. Even from All Might. Especially from All Might. Izuku looked down. But, he's the person I've always looked up to. It just would have meant everything, if, I know, Himura said, exhausted and vaguely sympathetic. I know. But All Might, he's like your, friend, isn't he? That explosion boy. Like 𝐀𝐦? Izuku asked, surprised. Well, they both have great quirks, but 𝐀𝐦 is nothing like All Might. He is, Himura disagreed firmly, because neither of them would ever have the capability to understand you. Born with such powerful quirks, perfect for their paths to becoming heroes, they don't know what it means to strain themselves. They know how to fight, but they don't know what it really means to fight. Well, yeah, you could see it that way, Izuku admitted softly. Some people, they have all the luck. Himura snorted, unamused. Yes. But do you want that? Would you want to have been born with such luck? Izuku remained thoughtful, ruminating carefully over Himura's words. Did he want luck? Did he need it? I don't know, Izuku admitted. I don't think so, actually. Of course, I would have preferred to have a quirk back then, but now. I don't want luck. I've always had to claw my way up to the top, desperate for approval or recognition. For people to just see me as equal. Desperate to prove myself, to people who don't even know me. And I think, for better or for worse, that constant struggling and desperation to reach something makes me who I am. For the first time that day, Himura graced him with one of his rare smiles. Now you're getting it, he said, and perhaps, now, you understand why I didn't offer you my opinion. Midoriya, it shouldn't matter what other people tell you, not even me. Everyone will always tell you no. You have to get used to that. You cannot ask people for approval, it opens you up for disappointment. It will stunt your growth. I still stand by my decision to ask All Might, Izuku argued. I understand what you mean, sensei, and actually, I agree. But I couldn't have gone my entire life without knowing what he thought. He's the one who gave me the courage to even consider doing this, even if he doesn't agree now. Maybe you're right on that one, he conceded, but now that you've heard it, it's time for you to move on. Stop clinging to the improbability of All Might falling at your feet and praising your strong work. Stop clinging to this idea of validation. It won't happen. At you, quirks will be struggling to make themselves known, and they're going to mess up. A lot. But that will be okay, because they're learning, and of course they're good, if they made it in. But if you mess up when you're there, it won't be okay. It's a sign that you were only taken in for some kind of affirmative action bullshit, it's a sign that they pitted you, it's a sign that you were never good enough and they lowered their standards when it came to you. Comments like that are inevitable. You have to get used to it. Their perspectives are biased, they've been forced to believe that they are their quirks. That's the reason they made it so far. It's incomprehensible to them, to think that someone can be more than their quirk. And if they were the ones who were quirkless, they would never even think about being heroes. But your resolve is strong. It has to be, if you want to do this. If you want to be a hero, it doesn't matter what anyone else believes. The only person who has to believe it is yourself. The only person who has to believe it, is myself. Don't ever forget that, Himura went on, eyes blazing. Never. Spell it out every day, very neatly, in one of your notebooks. Carve it into the skin of your hands. Tattoo it to your forehead, if you must. But don't ever forget that. Izuku gazed up at Himura-sensei, unblinking and frozen. His chest felt tight, but in a different way from before. His arms were shaking. But he wasn't scared, or upset, not anymore. He was excited, anticipating. His eyes began to water. Himura looked alarmed. "Why are you crying again?" he asked, scratching the back of his neck uncomfortably. "I thought we were past that." I'm happy," Izuku managed to get out. "I just really needed to hear that." "Thank you. You're right. And, even though you said that I shouldn't need anyone else's encouragement, I'm glad I have yours." "Who said you had my encouragement?" "I was just saying you shouldn't rely on other people's judgments." "Someone had to remind you of what your resolve was, brat," he drawled. "But sensei," Izuku said. "You said it yourself. About kids at UA and how I have to ignore their comments when I'm there. That means you think that I'll make it to UA, and I'll be fighting to be a hero alongside them. So you do think I can do it?" Himura scowled, looking away, but he didn't bother to refute Izuku's claim. Izuku smiled. Newfound happiness and exhilaration burgeoned forth in his chest, for the first time in a while. As UA's exam deadlines loomed closer, it became easier to lose sight of his goal, as the tall metal gates and looming structures grew more corporeal in his mind, rather than remaining distant. Wispy today, especially, dealt him quite a bit of damage from which he wasn't sure he could recover, but Himura-sensei made it feel like it was only a fading scar, unnoticeable and sure to disappear with time. While Himura still had his back turned, Izuku suddenly felt the urge to convey his genuine, earnest appreciation in a more palpable way. "Thank you didn't really cover it." He reached over, closing his eyes and curling his arms around Himura-sensei's waist in a warm hug, and Himura immediately gripped Izuku's wrists with his right hand, bent forward at an angle, lifting Izuku off his feet, and used his left hand to grab Izuku's shoulder and flip him straight onto the ground in front of him. Izuku landed on his back with a thud, groaning. "What was that for?" Izuku asked grumpily, as he struggled to sit up. "It wasn't obvious. You went for a tackle." "That was a hug. I was hugging you." "Oh," Himura said eloquently, having the good grace to look mildly embarrassed. "Well, it was very surprising. Unexpected." Clearly, Izuku huffed. "Don't worry. I wouldn't expect it again, from me. In fact, maybe you should have expected some kind of defense," Himura sniffed, blatantly ignoring Izuku's protest. "How do you expect to get into you, like this?" "Forgive me for thinking I could have 5 minutes to relax after being continuously attacked for a full day," Izuku said, rolling his eyes. "I should have known better." "Yes, you should have," Himura agreed, again disregarding Izuku's tone, "since we have a lot of work to do over the next 10 months. Even if you're not taking the heroics exam, you still have to stay in shape if you want to keep up. Are you ready?" Izuku's lips curled into a smile. His clothes were still torn and dripping with slime, his face still blemished with tear tracks and eyes still red. But he didn't feel disgusting and ruined anymore. He felt good. "Yes, I am." On his way home, Izuku was sure he attracted many stares, in this state. Maybe some of them even recognized him from the attack. He was probably all over the news, by now. He paid them no mind. Swinging his backpack aimlessly, he turned onto his street, walking slowly towards his home as his mind scrambled for some way to explain everything to his mom. As he was walking, a hand reached out to grab his shoulder from behind. Instinctively, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 shifted his shoulder out of the grip and grabbed the hand at the same time, twisting it backwards roughly. 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 grunted as he was forced to fall downwards, gripping his wrist tightly. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 blinked, horrified, and immediately let go. 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴₁ exclaimed. I'm so sorry, I didn't know it was you, save it, nerd, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 growled, getting back to his feet and looking furious. I bet you think you're so much better than me now, huh? Did it make you feel good to think you saved me? Did it feel good to get the upper hand on me, just then? I didn't get the upper hand on you, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 said, frowning. I was just surprised, it was an instinctual defense. And no, I don't think I'm better than you. Why do you always think that I do? It's obvious, he said, when you do 𝐓𝐡𝐢 like making the stupid decision to jump into the middle of that attack, because you thought I needed saving. Because you thought you were strong enough to face the villain, and I wasn't. I wasn't thinking that at all, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 replied, frustrated. I wasn't thinking anything at all. You were choking. I reacted. I just didn't want you to be hurt. I didn't want you to die. You thought I would have died, without you and your useless help. 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 snarled. I'm not that weak. And I don't need your help. I never need your help, so don't bother me with it. It didn't make me feel good to save you because I only felt scared. I didn't want you to be in a situation like that in the first place. Not because I don't think you can handle it, he added, seeing 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸's face light up in rage, but because we were friends, once. And friends don't like seeing their friends suffer. At least, that's how it's supposed to be, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 thought, smiling mirthlessly. Why do you keep mistaking caring for someone as pity or condescension, he asked. 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 was silent. His shoulders were hunched forward and his eyebrows were twitching angrily, fists clenching and unclenching. He looked angry, but also confused, like he was focusing all of his energy on trying to understand something. If someone weaker than you offers their help, that means you're weak, too, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 bit back, finally, although the vicious statement seemed to lack its usual bite. Caring. Don't make me laugh. If they cared, they'd respect your strength and quit challenging your place. Challenging what place? Sometimes people like to do things for themselves, you know, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 said, frowning, so it doesn't mean they're saying they're better than you or replacing you. It just means they disagree with you about something. No one can be right all the time. At this, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 still looked angry, but also extremely scattered and uncomfortable. It's not brave, or heroic, or whatever the F you think it is, to challenge someone stronger than you like that. It's idiotic. The weak have no place telling people above them what to do. And don't tell me people aren't weak, there's no equality. People either win or lose. If they're not weak, then why can't they stop the people they want to? 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 demanded angrily. For once, however, despite the bitter invective, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 got the feeling that 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 was asking a genuine question rather than insulting him in some way. The words rung very similar to what 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 had said to him a few hours ago, before he left 𝐬𝐻𝐸 on the ground. It seemed like he truly didn't understand how people could keep fighting, if they kept losing. Like they should just accept they had no right to even try, if they couldn't do anything about a situation themselves. Like there weren't different types of strength. People choose not to fight back for many reasons, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 said, just like people choose to stand up for their beliefs at other times. It's because they're doing what they think is right. Winning and losing doesn't cross their minds at all. We can choose to fight, or not to fight, based on how we feel. It's not a reflection of how we think of our opponents. It's not a reflection of how I think of you. I've only ever thought you were amazing. As if he could hear those unspoken words, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 shifted in his spot, his expression of fury dissipating only into mere frustration, which was really the most positive expression 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had seen him display in quite some time, especially in relation to him. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 allowed himself to feel some hope, perhaps still lingering in his body after his conversation with Himura-sensei, burgeoning once again because it seemed that for the first time in many years, 𝐀𝐦 was listening. Of course, this is when 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had to mess it all up again. Eager to see that he was getting through to 𝐀𝐦, he pressed forward. How could I just leave you there? It wasn't right to just watch you choke, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 said desperately. It looked bad. The heroes weren't doing anything to help you, even when your explosions couldn't break the sludge monster apart, and you looked scared, so I just wanted to help, like a small fire on the verge of dissipating into smoke, only to have a strong wind 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝑝 it back up into a frenzy. 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 exploded in every sense of the word. His palms were crackling and he let out 2 large blasts, causing 𝐬𝐡𝐚 to flinch and step backward quickly. Scared? I wasn't scared, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 hissed. I'm not like you, crying over everything. And why would you even want to help? It's not like you did anything. It's like they said, you were a liability. You were stupid. Useless. You distracted it, but All Might did all the work. And that's how it will always be. That's all I came to tell you. I don't owe you anything, because you could never do anything in the first place. Don't think you can still come to you, eh? They would never want someone like you. And never try to help me again, Deku. With that, he threw another crackling explosion at 𝐬𝐡𝐚's face while 𝐬𝐡𝐚 raised his arms to block out the damage. When he cautiously brought his arms back down, he could see 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 stalking off into the distance, not bothered to listen to 𝐬𝐡𝐚 anymore. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 exhaled exasperatedly, kicking at the ground, strong. It was always 1 step forward and 2 steps back with 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸. Every phrase out of his mouth had to be cautiously and intricately crafted, smooth words wrapped up in underlying praise and respect. Painstakingly constructed so that it wouldn't hurt 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸's immense pride, so enormous yet so fragile. Careful not to imply that he felt regular human emotions on the same level as everyone else. And 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was so tired of it. But regardless of what he thought, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 knew he had helped, if only for that brief pocket of time where 𝐀𝐦 broke free because of the distraction 𝐬𝐡𝐚 provided. And again, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 now knew better than to expect appreciation. He didn't need it. Sorry, 𝐀𝐦, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 whispered to the empty space around him. Looks like you'll still be seeing me in 10 months. Time passes quickly when you have no one else to spend it with, except for yourself and your instructor. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 worked harder than ever, knowing he wouldn't have much time to train once he entered UA and wanting to completely master his skills. Himura-sensei worked him to the bone, but by the end of it, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was as proud as he was exhausted. Thinking back to so long ago and seeing where he was now, it was such a stark improvement, in both the physical and mental departments. Instead of feeling like an overwhelming urge messily patched together by stray hopes and slowly growing confidence, he began to feel like a person. His mother seemed to notice, as well. After the sludge monster incident, 𝐴𝐻𝐸 had been so worried. She ran her hands over his body multiple times, crying her worries out and hugging him close to her chest. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 had almost been annoyed, exasperated with her constant concern over him, before he immediately felt ashamed. Hadn't he reprimanded 𝐀𝐦 for the same thing? Caring for someone was not the same as thinking that they're weak. Not everything had to be about his quirklessness, despite his determination to martyr himself that way. His mother was worried because she loved him. While it was true that over the years, she had always seemed uneasy of his strong resolve to be a hero, she had never once tried to stop him or discourage him. And after the incident, 𝐬𝐡𝐚's resolve had only grown stronger. But 𝐬𝐡𝐚 caught his mother smiling at him more often, less uncomfortable by the idea. Maybe it was because she, too, had seen the immense change in his confidence. Maybe she had seen how this determination made him healthier, stronger, happier. On the other hand, school had been going as well as it could have been. For the 10 months between the sludge monster incident and the entrance exam, 𝗵𝘃𝐻𝐸 seemed content to ignore 𝐬𝐡𝐚, determined to distance himself from the boy who stepped in to save him. And 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was content to let it happen. Their relationship still made 𝐬𝐡𝐚 uneasy, and there would always be that part of him still yearning for 𝐀𝐦's friendship, but he could also tell when something was hurting him. Seeking out 𝐀𝐦 and continually trying to explain his thoughts until he was blue in the face would have no effect, and he knew it. In due time, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 would let his actions speak for him. Maybe, then, something could change. So, with trepidation and excitement in equal parts, 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 finally stood in front of you, 𝐴's large metal gates blocking off the main building to the school. He wandered through the opening, gazing up at the tall buildings sheathed in pristine blue glass windows. Dazed, he looked around, eventually spotting some signs pointing towards the orientation rooms and written exam area. He entered a building on the left, eventually coming to an assembly hall where potential students were milling about in seats, chatting with each other and waiting for the orientation to start. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 stared at the faces. There were many friendly-looking ones, a kid with spikes coming out of his head, a blonde girl smiling as she showed everyone how she could create clouds of mist, a tall boy with his arms around two others, presumably his friends. He wished he could join them. It couldn't be so strong, could it? He would just have to walk up and introduce himself, compliment them on their quirks, and then they'd ask about his. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 immediately turned away, discarding the idea, and took a seat at the end, by himself. He looked down at an information package he picked up and sighed in relief as a man with heavily slicked-back blonde hair and a mustache, as well as shiny glasses, took a spot at the front. Present Mike, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 thought excitedly as his fingers twitched toward his backpack for his notebook. Good morning, potential students. Present Mike practically screeched across the room. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 winced, restraining himself from slapping his hands over his ears. Sorry, maybe that was a bit loud, Present Mike said, a bit sheepishly, as he lowered his voice a bit. Welcome to you, 𝐴's entrance exam orientation session. The morning will be used for written exams for all departments, and if there are some of you in this room interested in taking the exam for heroics, there will be another orientation session in the afternoon before you take the additional heroics exam. For a brief moment, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 allowed himself to think of the possibility of taking the heroics exam anyway. It couldn't hurt, could it? 𝐬𝐡𝐚 shook his head. It would be humiliating. He had researched information about 𝐴's entrance exam for heroics countless times, and it was always something ridiculously biased towards destructive quirks. He tuned back in to present Mick's introduction. Anyway, that's that. Each of you will be assigned a room number in which you will write the written exam. If you're going into heroics, stick around for the afternoon session. If you're going into support, remember to submit your portfolio. General education students and business students only need to write the written exam, Present Mike concluded, still grinning madly. With that, he gestured all the kids to the set of tables at the back, where everyone could find their room number. Everyone rose, hurrying towards the back to see the list of names. Some of the kids who came here with friends high-fived each other when they saw that they were in the same room, others in different rooms sighed disappointedly but made promises to meet up after the exam. A common factor, however, was that everyone looked excited. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 felt a faint smile threatening to erupt on his lips, as well. Just being here was making him enthusiastic. As he finally found his name and room number, room 302, he turned to leave the orientation room and immediately bumped into someone. Oh. I'm so sorry, I didn't see you there, 𝐬𝐡𝐚 said, smiling apologetically up at a boy with unruly purple hair and deep bags under his eyes. The boy's expression didn't change. He merely sighed, scowling slightly, and walked past 𝐬𝐡𝐚 to look at the list. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 froze in place, a bit confused. He didn't even do anything yet, why did the boy already seem to dislike him? Well, good luck on the exam. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 exclaimed, smiling at him again. The boy glanced back briefly and rolled his eyes, turning back to look at the list. Right, he responded flatly. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 deflated. He turned away, giving up on continuing the conversation, and headed toward his exam room. Some people, namely, him, just weren't good at making friends. It must have been something in his attitude, his personality. Maybe people could just tell he was quirkless and tried to avoid him. Maybe they heard him muttering to himself, or saw his twitchy fingers and unnecessarily nervous disposition, and decided it was best to steer clear. Maybe they just knew they wouldn't like him. Trying not to dwell on it for too long, he entered room 302 and took a seat at the back. Eventually, everyone must have arrived and taken their seats, because the proctor cleared his throat and went over the usual exam rules: no cheating, no phones turned on, no talking, and so on. Finally, you may begin, the proctor said, taking a seat at the front desk. Izuku released a deep breath to let go of his nerves. He flipped his paper up, filling out his name and personal information, and finally took a look at the first question. Izuku smiled and began to write. How did it go? What did you get for the first question in the second section? God, I'm so bad at math, a girl complaining to one of her friends as they left the exam room. Izuku trailed behind quietly. Forget that. What about the entire last section? This is supposed to be applicable to Gen Ed and business, too. Why did they have a whole essay question about hero analysis? A bunch of people here aren't even interested in that, the boy grumbled back. Izuku smiled. That part was his favorite. The limit had been 3 pages, but Izuku had made it up to 5 before he finally forced himself to stop writing. That part, at the very least, he was sure he did quite well on. Kaken must have done really well, too, Izuku thought to himself suddenly. He considered looking around to wish him luck on the practical exam, but changed his mind and decided that he didn't really feel like dying just yet. As he exited the building, he turned onto the main path so he could head out of the U complex, but got distracted by a loud voice as he passed by a large dome-shaped building with a crowd of prospective heroic students surrounding it. This must have been one of the practical examination centers. Please, everyone. It is necessary that we organize ourselves in an orderly fashion so that we can be better prepared when the exam starts, a tall boy with glasses was yelling, arms making strange slashing movements. A few kids snorted and rolled their eyes, ignoring him, while some smiled and stayed quiet. The boy looked familiar. Like Izuku had seen him before. Or maybe he had seen someone similar to him before. As Izuku stared at him, trying to place the face to a memory, or perhaps another figure, he didn't notice the bump on the ground in front of him and yelped as he tripped forward, right into another heroics candidate, who slapped his back. Izuku suddenly stopped falling, floating in midair. Sorry, a brown-haired girl said anxiously, helping him back to his feet and releasing him. I didn't mean to use my quirk on you, but I figured it would be better than falling. Izuku stared at her. A girl was talking to him. This had never happened before. Well, people in general didn't tend to talk to him, but this was entirely unprecedented. Izuku choked out unintelligibly. It's fine. It was an accident. Sorry for bumping into you. Thank you. No problem, she said cheerfully. So, your quirk must be object manipulation of some sort. It could be touch-based object control, in which you can control the direction or movement of something once you touch it, but that's probably not it, because you had to physically help me back to my feet. You were able to stop me from falling, though, so it's likely zero gravity related because I felt the sensation of my stomach lifting upwards as well. Yeah, that must be it, Izuku mumbled, muttering up a storm. He froze, suddenly realizing that he must have said this all out loud, in earshot of the girl who no doubt thought he was extremely strange by now. He looked up to the girl's face, and in affirmation of his thoughts, her mouth was open in shock. But she didn't look put off by him. That was really cool, she exclaimed. Izuku blinked in surprise. You really think so? Yeah. No one has figured it out so quickly. Is that related to your quirk or something, she asked, curious. Or something, Izuku said in response, not bothering to elaborate more. It wasn't likely he'd see her again, anyway. She was here for the heroics exam. She frowned in confusion, but must have accepted he didn't want to talk about it and didn't bother to pursue the topic. Are you ready for the exam, she asked. What? Oh, and no, I'm not taking the heroics exam, Izuku explained, feeling embarrassed for some reason. Probably because there was a whole horde of kids with undoubtedly powerful quirks right in front of him, all with good chances of becoming heroes, and he was just there. Oh, the girl said in surprise, blushing. Sorry, I just thought you were one of us. Izuku smiled ruefully. I will be one of you, very soon. I promise. But not today. No, I'm trying to get into Gen Ed. But, good luck. I'm sure you can do it, he encouraged. Thanks, she replied, beaming. Well, see you around. With that, she turned away and joined the crowd of kids again. Izuku smiled. His first successful interaction with someone else. That was nice. She didn't seem to mind his muttering either. Maybe if she ever found out about his condition, she, too, would be judging and doubtful. But for now, it was nice to be on the receiving end of some kindness and pretend it wasn't conditional. She seemed confident that they would both make it in. He let himself soak up that positivity for a moment. Their exams seemed to be starting soon, so Izuku took one last glance at the group of kids, wondering which ones would be powerful enough to make it in, and turned to leave. At the very last second, though, another person caught his eye. "DMN, I can't believe you constructed giant robots for us to destroy," a boy was saying, eagerly rubbing his hands together. "I guess that's what happens when you have a basically unlimited budget." "You're right, it does sound exciting though." "You don't have to hold back at all," another boy replied in response, grinning. Giant robots. Izuku shuddered just thinking about it. Yeah, there was no way he could take apart 10-foot-tall structures made of metal with just his bare hands and his resolve. He had definitely made the right call. Despite his relief at knowing he made the right choice, he couldn't help but feel indignant. There were so many useful quirks that would never stand a chance against giant robots but would be so useful in the field. 𝐸 entire heroics exam was a stunningly accurate example of quirk discrimination. They would be losing out on so many potential heroes because they were unwilling to accept non-offensive quirks in the first place. Instead, so many people had to struggle through the rigmarole of going the long way around instead of being recognized for their skill right away. No wonder prospective hero students like 𝐀𝐦 got so offended at the thought of the weak usurping their places and telling them off. They were all so used to instant gratification, automatic praise. Himura-sensei was right. They never had to struggle, not in the same way others did. Everything was made in their favor. The news about the robots certainly caught his attention, but those two boys weren't the people who caught his eye. No, it was the purple-haired boy from the orientation who Izuku focused his gaze on. He didn't realize the boy also wanted to join heroics. Earlier, he had given off a great impression of being reserved, distant, uninterested in his surroundings. But now, while the other boys were eagerly talking about the robots, the purple-haired one seemed to pale very slightly. His eyebrows were knit together. He still hung back on the edges of the group, aloof, but he also looked uneasy, troubled, like he needed reassurance. Help. Izuku wasn't sure why it got to him. Maybe the boy just had the normal nerves that one felt before an exam, but he got the feeling that it was more than that. He hesitated, thinking about walking up to the purple-haired boy and offering him some luck, some encouragement. Some kind words could go a long way. But then Izuku scanned the group again, spotting the missing face. 𝐀𝐦 wasn't in this group, but he could still hear his voice screeching somewhere in the recesses of Izuku's head, telling him how useless he was and how he could never help anyone. His kindness wasn't appreciated, nor was it wanted or needed. Kind words could go a long way. They could travel from your mouth to someone's ears, curling through the nerves of their brain and sending warm, fuzzy signals straight to their heart. Sometimes they could even travel from that someone's heart to the hearts of millions of other people, spreading through miles and miles of distance across cities and countries like dandelion seeds blowing in the wind to plant themselves firmly in new locations. But sometimes they fell short. Sometimes they couldn't even leave your mouth, and other times they did, only to splatter on the ground in front of you, crushed by all the people walking over the mess, and warping into something rotten. So Izuku stopped hesitating and turned away, decision made. Maybe it was a bit cowardly, too, but confidence was not something constant. It was a muscle that atrophied with time, when you didn't bother to exercise it enough. Izuku had been exercising it for years, but it tended to take quite a beating, for various reasons, time and again. There was only so much he had to spare. Izuku left the group behind and walked out the gates of 𝐸, trying not to give him a second thought as he made his way home. The boy would probably be fine. Not everyone needed his help. Objectively, Izuku knew he must have gotten into 𝐬𝐬. He had no particular trouble on the exam, in spite of all his overthinking and constant worrying. Still, nerves crawled up from his stomach and remained lodged in his throat as he held the envelope that 𝐬𝐬 had sent to his home with his name written on the front. His fingers rubbed over the seal, nails nipping the edges until he slowly pushed the front of the envelope open. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out the letter and unfolded the page. To Midoriya Izuku, thank you for expressing an interest in joining 𝐬𝐬 high school. Your score on the written entrance exam was 97%. Congratulations on achieving one of the highest scores this year. We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the general education department. Izuku exhaled loudly, flopping backwards onto his bed and laughing disbelievingly. He closed his eyes and smiled. He did it. Of course, this was supposed to be the easy part, but moving even one step forward was a huge relief. He aimlessly read over the rest of the letter, stomach turning in excitement and anticipation, when he heard a knock on the door. Izuku! 𝐬𝐻𝐻 called, as she waited outside the door. It's time for dinner. Mom! Izuku exclaimed, throwing himself off the bed and racing toward the door. I got in. 𝐬𝐻𝐻's eyes lit up and she smiled widely as she reached forward to hug Izuku. That's great, she exclaimed, arms wrapped tight around his shoulders and face resting on top of his head. I'm so proud of you. Now I'm even closer, Izuku whispered against his mom's neck. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 frowned slightly at this, her eyebrows furrowing, but she didn't let go. You are, she agreed a bit less enthusiastically. They stayed like that for a few more moments before 𝐬𝐻𝐻 drew back, still smiling. I guess it's a good thing I made 𝐜𝐡𝐻𝐬 to celebrate, isn't it, she said cheerfully, so let's go eat. Dinner was as quiet of an affair as usual, that is to say, not at all, with Izuku rambling about 𝐬𝐬 and his future classes and how he was excited to meet his new teachers and classmates and learn about their quirks. Well, you'll already know someone there, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 cut in. Really? Who? Izuku asked. Katsuki, of course, Mitsuki told me just today that he got into the heroics department. Top scorer, as usual, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 said, sighing. She wasn't oblivious, she was obviously somewhat aware of the broken relationship between Izuku and Katsuki, but she didn't know the whole story. That was something that could only be understood between two people, something that could only shared between quiet cries and numerous sparks and empty spaces and tears hastily wiped away. Oh, Izuku said simply, smiling very slightly. A part of him was excited and proud, he never had any doubts that 𝐻𝐻𝐻 wouldn't get in, after all. Izuku already knew how impressive 𝐻𝐻𝐻 was, that he was the best from their school and their whole neighborhood. But first place. In a whole generation of children from across the city, and from other cities, too. 𝐬𝐻 was the place to be for any potential hero in Japan. Izuku looked down at his plate, feeling conflicted. One part of him was thrilled, yes, but another part of him was worried, disbelieving, anxious. Was this always how it would be? Bakugo was often first in their middle school for academics, always first for athletics. He was first in track and field games, first in every school-wide competition, first in every race with other kids in the neighborhood. He just wins, and keeps winning. Bakugo always wins. Izuku walked through the gates of 𝐬𝐻𝐻, as a student, this time, not just an applicant. It felt good, walking through the fresh grass and sparse flowers sprouting from cracks in the sidewalk. It felt good entering the main building and seeing hordes of students chattering excitedly, walking to their new classes. It felt good turning the corner and seeing the doors to 1A and 1B, the first-year classes of the heroics department. It would feel even better when he could finally step through the doors, but today wasn't that day. Still, unbidden, his feet moved towards the doorway of 1A, his gaze focused on what was inside. He hadn't even realized he stopped in front of it until he heard a vaguely familiar voice snap him out of it. Oh. It's you, the brown-haired girl from the heroics entrance exam area said, surprised. Izuku stumbled back. Yes. Yeah, I'm going to my class now, I just got distracted, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 said, his tongue tripping over the words. Right, you went for Gen Ed, didn't you? She asked. Congratulations on getting in. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 smiled. Thank you, he said, finally managing to say something coherent. You, too, and, what about you? I mean, you're here, so I assume you got into heroics, but maybe you were also just walking through this hallway because you were curious. I wouldn't know, not that I think you couldn't get in. I did get in, I'm in 1A, she said, lips twitching while cutting him off. That's great, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 said, genuinely happy for her, I'm sure you'll do well. The girl smiled at him, her expression turning a bit softer. Thanks. I hope so, she said quietly, the entrance exam didn't go so great for me, you know. She laughed a bit nervously, shifting the weight off her right leg. I thought I was going to be crushed by a giant robot, but I guess it was stupid to assume that you would just let their applicants get killed, so it stopped right before it reached me, she said. Her lips were pursed upward, as though she was amused, but she kept shifting her weight uncomfortably. It sounds scary to me, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 admitted, I probably couldn't have dealt with it. I wouldn't worry too much about it, though, you got in, so now you learn how to deal with things like that. I suppose you're right, she agreed a bit reluctantly, thanks, Oh. My name's Midoriya 𝐬𝐡𝐤, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 said, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, thank you, Midoriya 𝐬𝐡𝐤, she exclaimed, back to her usual cheer, I'm Uraraka Ochako, maybe I'll see you around. Have a good first day. With that, Uraraka turned and entered the room. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 stared after her longingly, into the room he so desperately wanted to be in, but he sighed and turned away. He had to get to class 1C before he was marked late. Wandering through 2 more hallways, he finally found a door with 1C plated across the top. He could hear the sounds of laughter, loud banter, and chairs scraping across the floor. It was clear that the teacher hadn't arrived yet. Nervously, he stepped inside to survey the room and its occupants. A large group of people were sitting on desks near the back window, laughing loudly. 3 boys and 2 girls were clearly engaged in some discussion about a TV show. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 stared, fidgeting. Did they know each other beforehand? No, that wasn't likely. It would be strange for 5 members of the same middle school to end up in the same high school class at U. Of all places. Were they really just that sociable? How did they already know what to talk about? He almost considered joining them for a moment, before immediately discarding that thought on account of the fact that he had never watched a single episode of the show they were discussing. And also because he was just socially incompetent in general, and immediately entering a large group of outgoing soon-to-be friends would probably kill him. Looking elsewhere around the room also proved to be somewhat futile. Some smaller groups lingered in different clusters, while others just sat alone at their desk, playing on their phones. He sighed, resigning himself to just finding a seat for himself somewhere, and scanned for a friendly-looking face or a non-occupied desk, until, in the back right corner of the room sat the same purple-haired boy that 𝐬𝐡𝐤 had bumped into during the entrance exam. He was staring listlessly out the window, fingers tapping his desk impatiently, clearly uninterested in joining any of the chatty students around him. By all means, he should have been off-putting. He had deep bags under his eyes and a light scowl on his face, but 𝐬𝐡𝐤 had never had any sense of self-preservation before. If the purple-haired boy was here, that meant he didn't get through the heroics exam. But it did mean he wanted to be a hero. Glancing around at the happy faces, it was clear that a great majority of the room didn't have that goal in mind, so didn't it make sense for him to find someone who he had something in common with? Hesitantly, he stepped forward and began to walk in the boy's direction, intent on sitting at the desk next to him. He nervously played with the straps on his backpack as he stopped in front of the desk, head tilted slightly in the boy's direction. Hi, is it alright if I sit here? 𝐬𝐡𝐤 asked uncertainly. The boy glanced over and rolled his eyes, waving his hand impatiently to signal that he didn't care. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 dropped his backpack on top of the desk and took a seat, hesitantly glancing over a few times. What's your name? 𝐬𝐡𝐤 asked suddenly. The other boy sighed. What does it matter? He responded in a bored tone. Well, it doesn't, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 began, before widening his eyes. I didn't mean it like that. I only meant that it didn't matter what exactly your name was, it's just a name, not that you don't matter. And well, I wanted to know because we're classmates now. So I guess it would be a good idea to get to know each other. And, do you stop talking? The boy asked, one eyebrow raised in mild interest as he rested his chin on his hand. Izuku flushed. Sorry, I've been told that I ramble a lot, but it's really unintentional. Whatever, he said, rolling his eyes, and it's ♯. Hitoshi. Not that it matters, like you said. I won't be here for long, so I'm not around to make friends. At this dramatic pronouncement, Izuku merely blinked, unsure of how to respond to such a statement. If he was being honest, ♯ sounded a bit like one of those troubled main character protagonists of a teen-oriented coming-of-age movie. Maybe ♯ would fit in better with those kids at the back. But, likelier, ♯ was probably just not used to having friends either, maybe in a different way than Izuku. It was in the way he seemed to purposely turn away from new people entering the room, a careful veneer of indifference resting on his face while his fingers drummed impatiently on the wooden desk in front of him. I'm Midoriya Izuku began, and I don't see why you can't achieve your goals while having friends at the same time. In fact, I think it makes it easier. Well, I wouldn't know for sure, I guess, but it makes sense to me. Besides, I won't be here for long either. Why's that? ♯ asked, seeming to humor him as he studied his nails, a single note of curiosity hidden somewhere in his bored drawl. I have the same goal as you, I want to be a hero. Izuku said, smiling, so maybe we can help each other out. Immediately, ♯ scowled as he turned, finally looking Izuku in the eyes. How do you know I want to be a hero? ♯ demanded, eyes narrowed suspiciously. Izuku's eyes widened in response as he frantically waved his hands in the air, as if in some gesture of supplication. I didn't mean to sound creepy. It's just that, you bumped into me, on the day of the entrance exam. And then I saw you again in front of one of the hero exam centers, with the other prospective hero students. So I figure you must want to be a hero, too, but just didn't get in. At this, ♯'s eyes remained narrowed, although one of them appeared to twitch a little. Izuku noted this with unease, already reprimanding himself for reminding ♯ of something he already knew, something that undoubtedly stung. It was really no wonder why he didn't have friends. Clearly, no one had ever taught him how to actually hold a conversation. Not that I'm saying you can't be, just because you didn't get past the physical exam. The hero exam is extremely difficult, and they never accept more than 40 students per year. And there's still a chance to transfer over, if we show promise in Gen Ed. That's my plan, at least, Izuku admitted. ♯ continued to stare at him. If we both want the same thing, that makes you my competition, ♯ spoke finally, his voice cold, so I don't see why we would help each other. I don't need your help, nor do I want it. I will get into the hero program on my own, and if you're any good, then you should be able to do the same. In fact, it's easier if you just stay out of my way. I don't plan on falling behind. With that, ♯ turned away from Izuku, fingers knitted together, and eyebrows twitching in apparent frustration. He didn't seem very receptive to Izuku anymore, not that he appeared very receptive in the first place, but at least there had been something more than the cumbersome woolen blanket of silence that was now scratching at Izuku's eyes and smothering him in uncomfortable warmth. Izuku's eyes simply drifted downward, to his desk. More people flooded into the room, some laughing, some muttering quietly amongst themselves, some shyly taking their places without saying a word. Izuku did not bother lifting his head to speak to any of them. Any remaining words he wished to say were trapped somewhere between his quickly beating heart and the tight, sticky tunnel of space in his throat. Anything that managed to make its way out would undoubtedly be garbled and deformed. In less than a few sentences, he had already managed to antagonize someone he hoped could be his friend. Somehow, somewhere deep in his mind, Izuku recognized that it couldn't be his fault. He had truly tried to be kind and inoffensive, and ♯ was clearly not any kind of social butterfly. But maybe if he was more interesting, more likable, more restrained, more calm, more, the ever-present sting of rejection was still there, buzzing around his face like a common pest and constant reminder of what he lacked. For once, 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 sat quietly, hands folded together, and eyes blankly directed towards the chalkboard. Maybe 𝗫𝐸 was right, he needed to focus. It was almost time for class to start. "Attention, students," a distinctive voice drawled amongst the chatter, "class has begun." With a slightly bow-legged gait, the pro-hero 𝐷𝐸 entered the room and stepped in front of the chalkboard to face the class of general education students. Although his face was covered by his characteristic gas mask, eyes barely visible through the triangular holes, it was clear he was making a point to survey the room. His dark purple dreadlocks flowed outward behind him, mostly covered by the cowboy hat but stark against the red of his cloak. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 was shaking in his seat. 𝐷𝐸. Right in front of them. "My name is 𝐷𝐸, for those of you that don't know," 𝐷𝐸 spoke, finally, "and I will be your homeroom teacher this year." Animated bursts of whispering broke out across the room as students mumbled to each other. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 was no exception, muttering under his breath about how cool it was that he was going to be taught by 𝐷𝐸 and how he wondered if he could ask 𝐷𝐸 some questions about his quirk. ☫ shot him a look from the seat beside him and 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 quickly shut up, trying to restrain his excitement. Some of you may be wondering why a pro-hero is teaching you, the general education students, but despite the fact that 𝐸𝐽 is known to be a hero-oriented school, all the teachers here also have educational degrees. Further than that, it takes a trained eye to see which of you are cut out for the hero program, which I know some of you will want to transfer into, he said, with 𝐬𝐡𝐭 nodding absently in response. General education is not just about going to college or other pursuits, heroism is an important part of our society now, so 𝐸𝐽 teaches their students from the perspective of someone who's been through it all. You'll have to learn the ins and outs of hero studies as well, just like the hero students. That being said, it's perfectly fine if you aren't interested in being a hero. However, 𝐷𝐸 continued, with a faint smirk audible in his voice, that doesn't mean it'll be easy. People know you because of the reputation, not just the hero alumni. Every student in every department here is expected to be a high performer. 𝐸𝐽 is about success. With that, 𝐷𝐸 ended his little speech and turned to collect some papers off his desk. The class, enraptured by his words, appeared to break out of their trance as faint mumbles of curiosity began to echo within the room. 𝐷𝐸 began to hand out the papers to each student. "These are a series of evaluations," he said, ignoring a series of shocked complaints about how they thought the testing was already over. "You will have until lunch to finish them. They cover all the basic information from English, mathematics, science, literature, the arts, and heroics. I would like to see where you are with all of this material." After he finished handing out the sheets, 𝐷𝐸 trailed back to his desk, sitting in his chair and putting his legs up on the table, crossing them one on top of the other. He pulled his gun free from its holster and began cleaning, seeming utterly relaxed. For a few moments, some of the students merely looked at each other in shock. Others gaped at the sheer number of sheets, frantically working and apparently discovering new ways to give themselves whiplash, with how frequently they were looking at the clock. ☫ sighed, slowly picking up his pencil with half-lidded eyes, appearing to go through the material at his own leisurely pace. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 pressed his lips together and held his pencil tightly in his grip, eyeing the questions. They didn't look too bad, they mostly covered the material from the exams, with some extra information that they hadn't learned yet, but 𝐬𝐡𝐭 could probably make a few educated guesses to get a decent mark. He breezed through the math and science sections easily enough, managed his way through English and literature, and stumbled a bit when it came to the arts and art history. Soon enough, hours had passed. There were only about 20 minutes remaining, and 𝐬𝐡𝐭 still had the heroic section left. But this was always his strong suit, he was sure that he could manage it, even given the short time limit. When he turned the page, he noted with relief that there was only one question for the whole section, but an entire page was given as the potential space for a response. Nervously, he read the question to himself: if you were in public and you saw that someone was getting hurt at the hands of another, what would you do? 𝐬𝐡𝐭 stared. His pencil paused above the page. By all means, it should have been a very simple question. Something bad was happening to someone, obviously, a hero would take it upon themselves to stop it. But 𝐬𝐡𝐭 was not a hero, no matter how much he wanted to be. This was a fact hammered into his skull by various classmates, by his own teachers, and especially by pro-heroes at the scene of 𝗵𝘃𝗀's abduction by the slime villain. Wasn't that an exact mirror of this question? If your childhood friend is being strangled at the hands of a villain in the middle of a public street, and the passers-by and pro-heroes are doing nothing to stop it, would you do the same? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 knew the answer that the pro-heroes wanted to hear, the answer that 𝐶𝐈, too, would likely want to hear. But how could he write that down when 𝐀𝐦 was still out there, alive, breathing? Wait for the pro-heroes to arrive. But what if they do nothing? Don't get involved, you'll only get yourself hurt. But what if he can help? Alert the authorities and escape the situation if you can. But what if he couldn't live with himself if he just let them struggle in that fleeting PRD where he played the waiting game? What if they died, alone and scared? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 hesitated, before pressing the tip of his pencil to the paper and writing a single sentence down on the large expanse of the page. 𝐶𝐈 would no doubt be scouting for transfers to the hero program, like he said, and this could ruin his chances if he didn't answer the way he was supposed to answer. But just this once, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 thought that maybe the way he was supposed to answer wasn't the way he should. With that, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 rose from his seat to hand in his papers to the front of the room. 𝐶𝐈 tilted his head up as he accepted the package. Done already? He asked rhetorically, as 𝐬𝐻𝐸 looked up at the clock where only a few minutes remained before lunch. Finished with time to spare, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 replied, his lips twisting upward wryly. 𝐶𝐈 chuckled in response. There was a beat of silence as 𝐬𝐻𝐸 looked at his shoes, fingers twitching nervously. Finally, he looked back up at 𝐶𝐈, determined. 𝐶𝐈-sensei, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 burst out, I was just wondering if I could ask you a question about your quirk. I know you can control the trajectory of your bullets with perfect precision, but I was thinking about their reflective abilities. For example, when you shoot a bullet and it ricochets off another object, can you control the second-hand trajectory as well? I've noticed in some of your fights that when the villains wear armor and your shots bounce off, it still doesn't seem to cause trouble for anyone else around who may need to dodge. 𝐶𝐈 blinked, clearly taken aback by the overload of words flooding his ears. Interesting question. Can't say anyone has ever asked me that one before. No, I can't entirely control the second-hand trajectory, but there is an element of physics involved when I aim. The bullets automatically take the most perfect path to my target, meaning that they are also reflected with a perfectly elastic collision, as per what my quirk allows. This means that the path of the reflected shot is easily predictable. There is a reason even us pro-heroes have to learn science, instead of just training our quirks, he drawled, one often leads into another. Wow, you can really figure all that out in the middle of a fight? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 asked excitedly. 𝐶𝐈 shrugged. You get used to it, kid, he said modestly. So, are you a fan, or something? 𝐬𝐻𝐸's cheeks reddened. Ah, well, of course. I do admire you. It must have taken a lot of work to be able to use your quirk so well, and it's really cool how you can aim for weak points in different environments, like last year in your fight against Polaris when he used his attractive magnetic field on you to attract all those sharp, metallic objects to you, while keeping himself in the repulsive field. But you took advantage of it by shooting bullets at the base of the old glass statue above the building doorway, and the metal of the bullets lodged in the base was attracted to you, so it moved, but the heavy glass fell right on his head. Seeing how 𝐶𝐈's eyes widened, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 immediately tried to backtrack. And not that I was trying to keep a weirdly close eye on you, or anything. I just really like heroes, all of them. Quirks are really interesting to learn about because of how different they can be, and so many of them seem limitless, so I try to analyze them as much as I can by watching villain fights, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 babbled, breathless and slightly embarrassed at having rambled on in front of his new teacher, on his first day. He probably thought 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was one of those obsessive fanboys now. Not that he wasn't. He was, but he definitely could have been a little more low-key about it. Right, 𝐶𝐈 said, after a brief pause. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 couldn't see his expression behind the mask, but he could imagine. Well, I'm flattered, I think, and truly, I'd love to keep having this conversation, but I'm afraid it's time for lunch, he said, just as the bell rang. He got up, clearly intending to collect the remaining papers from some of the other students. Right. Sorry for taking up your time, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 said, bowing slightly, before exiting the room in a rush. Behind the mask, 𝐀𝐦 let out a faint smile. It was always nice to have a fan. He collected the papers from the other students in the room, watching as they trailed out of the class slowly, all while complaining about the evaluations. A few of them looked worried. He wondered why. Didn't he tell them that these weren't being marked for grades? They were obviously just assessments, so he knew which topics the class was more confident in, and which ones needed some improvement, as well as which students were ahead of middle school material. They were called evaluations for a reason. Shaking his head, he sat down at his desk and sorted the papers into a pile. He then picked up the one given to him just before the bell rang. Midoriya Izuku, read the name at the top of the page. He was certainly an interesting one, to say the least. Skimming over the booklet, 𝐀𝐦 noted that Midoriya was definitely ahead of the middle school standard, although he could stand to pay a little more attention to art history and literature. He arrived at the last section, the section he was most curious about. If Midoriya was so interested in heroes, why, then, was he here, in the general education department? The last question was a classic. Truly, there was no right answer, even if it seemed that one of them was more obvious than the other. Students always answered in long, rambling paragraphs that could be summed up by either the passive, find a pro hero, or the active, jump right in and help. But depending on the situation, both actions could be deadly. In society as it was right now, finding a pro hero was always the better option. Using your quirk without a license against someone else was a crime. However, this did not take self-defense into account, nor defense of others. So long as you didn't seek out the danger, it was permitted to use your quirk in a dangerous situation. Over the years, most students responded passively, likely knowing this was the response a pro hero would want to hear. They weren't wrong. But at some point, there was a question: how long could you remain a bystander? Would you just watch someone die? Because the truth of the matter was that contacting a pro hero, or finding a member of the authorities, or searching for someone else to help, it took time. It took so many valuable seconds that could determine life or death. If you were in public and you saw that someone was getting hurt at the hands of another, what would you do? 𝐀𝐦 almost smiled at the reckless, bold answer. Vague, but definitely got the point across. Aizawa would be a bit disappointed at the carelessness, but grudgingly approving of the determination. All Might would indubitably be pleased. It was clear that Midoriya thought any kind of injustice was his problem, too, not just the victims. Whatever it takes to keep us safe, the page read. Us. Not them. In the cafeteria, Izuku nervously glanced around for somewhere to sit. He noticed some of his classmates sitting together at a table near the entrance, already laughing and chatting with each other. Gazing at an empty seat at their table with barely concealed longing, he shook his head and headed towards a few empty tables at the side of the room. He almost stopped in his tracks when he noticed 𝗫𝐸 sitting alone at one of them, a light scowl permanently etched into his face as usual. Swallowing slightly, Izuku made sure to walk around him and simply took a seat a few tables away. He took out his lunch and began to pick at his food, inconspicuously glancing over at 𝗫𝐸 from time to time. He would like to join him, but 𝗫𝐸 made it clear that he wasn't interested in any kind of friendship. The way he said it, though. He said it like it was inevitable, as though friends were never an option for him. He sounded guarded, lonely, almost. Chewing thoughtfully on his noodles, Izuku replayed the scenario in his head. The dialogue, it was eerily similar to 𝐀𝐦's, if he was being honest. Not here to make friends, don't need any help, this is a competition. It was as if they were both cut from the same cloth. But sometimes Izuku thought 𝐀𝐦 was lonely in some way, too. He'd never say it to his face, of course, wouldn't even dare to mention it, but sometimes Katsuki seemed angrier when Tsubasa and his other friends gathered around him, gushing over his talents. Sometimes he sought Izuku out for the fun of knocking him down, maybe because he didn't know who else to turn to. Sometimes he grew bored, restless with his usual company, maybe restless with his own company, too. Just, alone with his irrational temper, and alone, even with his sycophants surrounding him, because it's not like they'd understand him, anyway. 𝗫𝐸 seemed a bit angry in his solitude, too. Not in the same way, no one was like 𝐀𝐦, but close enough that Izuku could spot the similarities. He, too, was alone by choice, by some self-inflicted, perceived choice, that prevented him from interacting with the people around him. Either way, there was an appropriate time for a proper intervention. With Kaken, Izuku never learned. He blindly followed Katsuki for years, heedless to his unholy screeching and ear-shattering demands to be left alone. Like a drowning man grasping for a single hand to drag him back to the surface, ears muffled to the sounds of pity, not realizing no one else wanted to be dragged down with him. He just kept grasping and grasping. He didn't understand, didn't want to understand, the death of a friendship, the final flames being extinguished. And with each determined attempt to keep it alive, Kaken grew more and more frustrated, more unwilling to listen, more desperate for an end. Izuku wouldn't make the same mistake twice. ― didn't want his company at the moment, and that was alright. And if he still didn't want it in the future, that would be alright too. But clearly, he did need help, and as much as Izuku wanted to respect his wishes to be left alone, he couldn't sit here quietly, knowing someone else was suffering in some way and he didn't even try to do something. Didn't it hurt when people glanced over him, back in middle school, and just looked the other way, assuming he would be as fine as ever? It didn't really matter if ― didn't want to be saved. Sometimes, he learned, people wouldn't ask for help, even when their whole personality was practically begging for it. With time, ―'s opinions could change and he could grow more receptive. That's what Izuku always liked to believe, always found admirable about people. That they could always change, given the chance. The rest of this table is empty, a voice said matter-of-factly, rudely interrupting his stream of thoughts, or was it mutterings? Izuku glanced up, seeing a girl with long, flowing, white hair and distant-looking hazel eyes. He stared, for a few moments, not just at her appearance, which would have been quite rude, but in response to her statement. He knew he wasn't the most sociable person around, but almost anyone would be at a loss for how to respond to such a question. Statement of fact. He wasn't sure what she was going for. Yes, he replied intelligently. The girl smiled, sitting down in front of him. She aimlessly played with a few locks of her hair for a few moments, before tucking them behind her ear. She then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small bag of grapes. "Do you want some?" she asked earnestly. Izuku continued to stare. "And no, I'm fine, thank you," he managed, still baffled. She nodded, popping 2 more grapes in her mouth. A few more moments passed, before, "Hiraiya Usagi," she said. "What?" "That's my name, in case you were confused," she explained, as if that perfectly well cleared up the situation for him. "Midoriya Izuku," he responded, figuring she seemed nice enough. "You sit 2 places behind me and 1 to the right," Hiraiya said, eating another grape. "Oh. I'm sorry, there were a lot of new faces in class, so I couldn't remember them all," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously as he let out a quiet laugh. "That's true," she conceded, "you were already fixated on the purple-haired one, so I'd be surprised if you noticed many others." Izuku choked on his own spit. Hiraiya placidly ate 2 more grapes while gazing intently at the blank, white walls behind them, as if they held some kind of mysterious secrets. I wasn't fixated on him. I was just a little curious, because he doesn't talk much and seems to like being alone, but I thought we had something in common," Izuku explained. "For some reason, he leaves out their shared ambition of being a hero. Maybe that was something that was only meant to be shared within the spaces of their competition. Apparently, it was all for naught anyway." "Oh, you mean how you both want to be heroes?" "Yes, I suppose not many in the class share that goal," Hiraiya agreed, as Izuku choked, again. "How do you know that?" he demanded. Hiraiya shrugged. "There's no trick. It's just kind of obvious," she said, back to twirling a white strand of hair. "You both have the same pinched expression whenever someone even mentions we're in general education. Neither of you wants to be here." Izuku looked down at the table, frowning. He didn't want people to think he was ungrateful. "It's not that I think Gen Ed is a bad option, or anything," he tried to explain, "it's just not where I want to be. I have a goal, I've had it for a long time, actually, and I don't think I should have to change it just because. Izuku cut himself off, glancing up at Hirai warily. Hirai, for her part, didn't seem to notice the awkward self-interruption, or was perhaps just ignoring it. Her gaze seemed strangely focused above his head, or was it on him? Your hair kind of looks like a bush, she stated. For the umpteenth time, Izuku merely stared. Hirai smiled, then waved her hand, and gorgeous blue butterflies suddenly started flitting about around him, some resting in his hair as if they were in search of pollen. Izuku gaped at the sight, mouth open as his hand mindlessly wandered out to touch their delicate wings. Pretty butterflies, a new, deeper voice said, as a tray slammed down on the table, startling Izuku. A girl with shoulder-length black hair and brown eyes took the seat next to Izuku, her sharp chin jutting out towards the creatures. Hirai, for her part, seemed entirely unfazed. "Thank you, Sasaki-chan," she said, smiling, "I can make more, if you'd like." Izuku, still confused, watched as more butterflies began to materialize around the new girl's, Sasaki's, head. Sasaki sighed. "I appreciate the view, but it would be nice to be able to see my own food, you know. And for the millionth time, you can just call me Yumi," she said, tilting her head and glancing lazily over at Hirai. "I suppose so, Sasaki-chan," Hirai agreed, blatantly ignoring her as some of the butterflies disappeared. "You can make butterflies. Or other creatures." Izuku blurted out, finally verbalizing his thoughts after being distracted by the continuous wing movements blurring his field of vision. "Of course not," Hirai said, as Izuku let out a yelp when his hand went straight through a butterfly's wing. "Life can only be created in one way. Didn't your parents have this discussion with you?" Hirai looked at him with an expression of the utmost seriousness, apparently waiting for an answer. Izuku sputtered as his face turned the same color as Hirai's red grapes, while Sasaki snorted into her lunch. Izuku stuttered, "That's not, I was just, want an explanation." "Demonstration?" Sasaki asked, leaning towards Izuku and batting her eyelashes. Izuku yelped, immediately sliding himself a seat over. He didn't even know who this was, or what was happening, but he was already out of his depth. "And no, I'm good, I was only asking if that was her quirk," Izuku somehow managed to force out while he tried desperately to dull the red in his cheeks. "Where'd you find this kid, Usagi?" Sasaki asked, snickering. "He sits 2 places behind me, and 1 to the right," Hirai answered promptly, "and you sit 2 places in front of him. Also, he is our age, I presume." Sasaki rolled her eyes. "Thanks, next time I'll ask you for the latitude and longitude, just for the extra challenge," Sasaki said, then immediately held her hand up as Hirai's mouth opened again. "Actually, let me just stop you right there, I'm sure you'd still have an answer." Hirai frowned. "I'm Midoriya Izuku," Izuku said, after a brief moment of silence. "Yes, you told me that already," Hirai responded, looking at Izuku. I know that, but I figured, Sasaki-kun didn't know, probably," Izuku stammered out. "Oh. Good thinking." Sasaki cut in, studying Izuku. "Not used to talking to people, are you? Was it that obvious?" "Well, I guess not," Izuku laughed nervously, "but that's not because I dislike talking to other people, or anything, so other people dislike talking to you." He froze. "I'd hope not, but it seems that way sometimes," he admitted. A beat of silence echoed around their table, while Izuku was already kicking himself in his head for making himself seem so pathetic. He may as well have spilled his life story to them to garner some more pity, while he was at it. He opened his mouth, trying to think of a way to backtrack, but Sasaki shrugged. "Weird, you seem pretty harmless to me," she replied, taking another bite and appearing to drop the subject. Hirai nodded absently, crafting more butterflies of different colors, pink and yellow mixing with the blue. Izuku's attention was yet again caught by the sight. "What is your quirk, then?" Izuku asked, enraptured by the beauty. "You can make butterflies, but they disappear when you touch them, so it's some kind of mirage-type quirk." "Illusions." "Illusions," Hirai agreed. Izuku's eyes lit up. "That's amazing, the things you can do with a quirk like that can be almost limitless. Is there any restriction on what you can make people see? I'm sure you can create regular, inanimate objects, but it's amazing that you can create realistic-looking living creatures, too. Can you only do that with simple, small animals, or is it possible with humans and large land mammals as well? Is there a time limit on your creations? He asked excitedly. 𝐻𝐸 blinked at him. Izuku almost deflated. Sorry, was that too much? It can't be too big. The biggest thing I've made is the size of our classroom, and it took up most of my energy. Simple animals are easiest to make, especially when they don't make noises and don't have a wide range of movements, like butterflies. Bigger animals, like elephants or giraffes, and complex creatures, like humans, would take up too much energy because of their countless complications, habits, and behaviors. I might be able to make a general image of them, but they probably wouldn't move properly or talk. There is no time limit. Once I expend energy into making a creation, the energy already exists in it, so it will not dissipate unless I want it to go away, or unless someone touches it, she recited, answering every one of Izuku's questions in order. Although he was the one who asked, Izuku was shocked. Most people just stared, or laughed, or looked confused, whenever Izuku spouted out a barrage of questions about their quirk. Even Sasaki had an eyebrow raised in his direction when he began his tirade. 𝐻𝐸 simply seemed to take it in stride, like it was regular conversation. Maybe it was, to her. He almost felt the sting of happy tears in his eyes. He was so grateful that she just responded to him, like it was normal. Even now, she turned back to making her butterflies with some dragonflies included in the mix as she hummed quietly to herself. He looked down at the table, smiling slightly. Maybe things would be okay here. 𝐻𝐸 was a bit strange, in a good way, and Sasaki was more on the abrasive side, but they didn't seem to mind sitting here with him. What's your quirk, Sasaki-kun? He questioned boldly, if you don't mind my asking, that is. Why would I mind your asking? Sasaki asked, leaning back and tilting her head to squint at him. That's, the first question anyone bothers to ask around here. Neither of you asked what my quirk is, he pointed out quietly. Oh, good, so it was obvious that I don't care, Sasaki stated plainly. I mean, does it matter? It's not like it says anything about you or your personality. Izuku's head jerked up. He twisted his fingers nervously. You're right, he agreed, and I hope you don't think I was asking you because I thought it defined you or something. I just really like learning about quirks. Yeah, I got that before I even started talking to you, Sasaki snorted. Izuku blushed slightly in response. You want to know about my quirk, huh? Sasaki went on, thoughtful. I think it's best experienced firsthand. Izuku gazed at her intently, suddenly nervous as she grinned amusedly and reached out her arm and grasped his hand. Immediately, his face went from just returned to its normal complexion to blazing fire at 200 degrees. A girl was holding his hand. However, just as suddenly, he couldn't feel the heat on his face anymore. He felt numb, his face, his fingers, and just his whole body, actually, like when his legs were all pins and needles after they fell asleep. Colors blurred together in front of his face, vague sounds drifted in and out of his eardrums, his mouth was dry and tasteless, it was like he was submerged into half-emptiness and couldn't feel anything properly at all. Sasaki let go of his hand, and Izuku let out a gasp as everything in his surroundings came together again. He took a few moments to get his bearings together as he whipped his head back and forth frantically, making sure he could take everything in properly again. Fun experience? Sasaki asked, smirking. You could say that, Izuku breathed out. What just happened? Unbeknownst to himself, he began muttering up a storm again. Maybe it's some kind of brain-stunting quirk, it obviously affected my mind. But only some parts of the brain, how I perceived things. Vision and hearing were both muddled, as well as touch and taste. Now that I think about it, I couldn't smell properly either. It must be a sensory deprivation quirk or, no, a sensory distortion quirk, that's it. It distorted my sense of current conditions, it didn't just remove them entirely. I wonder if it could focus on only one sense while ignoring the others. Or only some combination of the five? Izuku looked up, where Sasaki looked surprised, and Hirai looked, how she usually did.
Please, stop apologizing, it's getting old and I've barely known you for longer than 15 minutes, Sasaki interrupted.
I don't know why you would apologize, anyway, it's kind of impressive that you figured that out so quickly. My quirk is usually a little tricky to understand. Good to know you do have a brain under that twitchiness. Izuku looked at Sasaki for a moment, marveling at receiving that reaction for the second time. Uraraka, too, had seemed impressed when he did it. Then again, they didn't have to hear him do it 5 times a day, 35 times a week, several hundred times a year. Irritation would probably come in due time. 𝐻𝐿 and the rest of his old classmates had proven that much. Speaking of which, the first-year hero classes would be eating in here too, wouldn't they? Izuku lifted his head to survey the room, craning his neck for any sign of 𝐻𝐿, or Uraraka, or anyone else that seemed like a hero in training. He couldn't seem to spot any of them at the tables close to him, but there, at the back of the room, he saw a familiar bob of brown hair. Uraraka was sitting at a table next to a few boys and another girl, eating her lunch quietly. Izuku frowned. They all seemed pretty quiet, actually. He was aware that the hero program was a serious affair, but he would have thought there would be a few cheerful people floating around, Uraraka included. Noticed the quiet too? Sasaki asked, nudging him. She seemed to revel in the yelp he let out, smirking at his flustered face. Class 1A has just realized how serious you need to be if you want to be a hero. What do you mean? Izuku asked, confused. You haven't heard. Aizawa, Class 1A's homeroom teacher, has already expelled a student. Some tiny grape-looking kid, from what I heard. Didn't seem like a great loss. Shocked, Izuku glanced back over at the table Uraraka was sitting at. The mood wasn't necessarily somber, but they definitely looked a little less carefree than everyone else in the cafeteria. Izuku couldn't imagine it, struggling past the entrance exams, pushing through the practical hero exam, feeling the relief and joy of an acceptance to U.A.'s famed heroics program, only to lose it all in a single day. That would crush him, maybe even more than a flat-out rejection. At least that wouldn't involve leading you on, like you were following a trail of candy and gumdrops to a house made of chocolate, only to find out you were going to be eaten alive once inside. What did he do? Izuku whispered. Absolutely nothing, Sasaki sighed. They had some evaluation, and that kid was last. He wasn't good enough, so they threw him out. Think it shocked them all, really? No one would have expected a teacher to be serious about that, but that's just who Aizawa is. Izuku swallowed. Not good enough. Words that would forever ring through his head, reverberating around in his skull no matter how strong he tried to tell himself that he could do it. What if it all was for nothing? What if he ended up like that kid, whatever his name was? Working so strong to get in, sweating and bleeding and crying every step of the way, only to face reality once he was in, only to see that everyone else was just levels above him. Only for this Aizawa to decide he wasn't worth it. Breathe, would you? Sasaki said to him, her eyebrows knitted together, it's not like you're expelled. Aizawa is kind of known for being a hard-ass around here, anyway, he's expelled a full class before. Izuku felt like he was beginning to turn green, a lovely shade to match his hair and eyes. More butterflies materialized around his head, as well as little birds who seemed to open their beaks to chirp but wouldn't make any sound. He blinked at the sudden distractions. I don't think you're making him feel better, Hirai said matter-of-factly. It's probably because he wants to be a hero, too, and he's getting worried because you implied the standards would be too high. Izuku coughed. Hirai was weirdly perceptive, even when she seemed spaced out half of the time. Oh, Sasaki commented unapologetically, didn't know you wanted to be a hero. Doesn't change what I said, though, that much was the truth. I know, Izuku sighed, resigned, it's just strong to hear. I know it won't be easy. It might be okay, if you're impressive enough in class and in the sports festival.
Although you seemed weirdly evasive when asking about our quirks earlier, so, what? Don't think yours is good enough. Strong to believe from someone as confident as you, Sasaki said dryly, studying her nails. You could say that, Izuku replied softly, steeling himself, because I don't have one. Hirai tilted her head at him, frowning. Sasaki, too, remained silent for once, eyes narrowed. Oh, Sasaki said simply. Oh, Izuku agreed. Oh. Hirai added thoughtfully. That explains a lot. Mostly why you look like you're having a heart attack whenever the topic of quirks comes up. And also why you cut yourself off a lot. And why you look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, Sasaki announced, almost sounding bored. Seriously, chill. You look like you're going to spontaneously combust. You don't think I'm stupid? Izuku asked quietly. Oh, I'm sure you're kind of stupid, Sasaki said flatly, but everyone is, so, whatever. I don't know. It's not really my problem, is it? I admit that I'm having trouble seeing it, but I guess there are some heroes out there who don't really have offense-type quirks. Don't expect any encouragement from me, though. I don't want to be the reason you get your hopes up for nothing. If you think you can do it, prove me wrong. Hirai hummed. It seemed like you didn't want to tell us, Hirai said suddenly. Well, it's not that I'm ashamed of it, exactly, Izuku muttered, shuffling his feet, but it doesn't exactly garner the best of reactions either. What, people are mean to you because of how you were born? Sounds like some bullshit, Sasaki remarked, or was it just because your goal sounds like a pipe dream? Either way, no one else should be able to say anything about it. Fail or succeed, it's your choice. Your life to mess up. No point in not letting you try, who knows what we might find out. Izuku's eyes welled up a bit. Sometimes, when new people approach him, he just stops and can't do anything but stare. No matter what they look like or sound like, he can somehow taste ash in his mouth and smell the fading smoke. Phantom bangs rupture his ears and the aftershocks are so obvious in the tremors of his hands, he tries to hide them. His cheeks feel blotchy and wet and he is frozen in time, with his breath caught in his chest. This time, he only smells the delicious cafeteria food and feels warmth without being thrown face first into the flames, sees the peaceful blue butterflies, and hears the soothing calm of a low, agreeable voice. Thanks, he managed to get out, it really means a lot. I've been trying, recently, to only focus on my own opinion, but it's still strong to do that right away, so I appreciate that you aren't just telling me it's impossible. Well, don't cry, Sasaki muttered, awkwardly tugging her fingers through the ends of her hair and looking away. Aren't heroes supposed to be strong, or calm, or something like that? I think heroes are allowed to be happy sometimes, though, Hirai said seriously, those looked like happy tears. They were, Izuku said, head tilted down towards the table, lips very slightly upturned. I don't usually get that reaction. Their table was silent again. Clearly, there was a lot to unpack from that statement, but none of it was worth the time and painstaking efforts of unpacking, not now, at least. It was as if pest control had managed to trap a multitude of various types of vermin. There were containers and cages filled with an eclectic amalgam of venomous snakes and blind rats and headless cockroaches. It would be simple enough to release them out in the wild, but what followed would no doubt be ugly and unpleasant. Extermination was a service for a reason, and self-pity wasn't a good look on anyone. I'm sorry, Sasaki offered lowly, seeming surprisingly genuine for once. It's never nice to be treated like that. Hirai closed her palm and opened it again, revealing a single white stargazer lily. Izuku smiled, a bit sad but also a bit hopeful, and unthinkingly reached out to touch her creation again. The flower dissipated at the touch of his hand.